The next 3 hours is your chance to talk with author and journalist Chris Hedges. The Pulitzer Prize-winning foreign correspondent will take your calls, emails, and tweets on topics such as war, religion, and politics. Chris Hedges holds a master's in divinity and is the author of 9 books, including War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, Losing Moses on the Freeway, and his latest, The World as It Is.
Chris Hedges, in your most recent book, The World as It Is, Dispatches on the Myth of Human Progress, you write, brace yourself, the American empire is over, and the descent is going to be horrifying. How did you come to that conclusion?
Well, first of all, I spent 20 years on the outer reaches of empire as a foreign correspondent. So I've seen an aspect of empire that most people have not, unless you're in the military or perhaps the foreign service. And I think all of the red signs, the sort of red warning signs are there. I think also the fact that I spent so long outside the United States gave me a kind of perspective when I returned. I understood how radically the country had changed in the 2 decades that I was away. I think for those who had remained within the borders of the United States, those changes had been more incremental and perhaps less perceptible.
What are some of the symptoms, the signs that the American empire is over?
The biggest sign is the fact that we are following the trajectory of all empires, which is that they expand beyond their capacity to sustain themselves. We have run up the largest deficits in human history, which in the bottom line is we can't repay it. We have done so at the cost of our infrastructure, our public education, our working class. We're hollowing the country out from the inside, and the physical evidence is all around us, plunging roughly 1/3 of Americans into poverty or near poverty, according to the latest statistics. Our bridges, our roads are collapsing, libraries are being closed, fire stations are being closed. These are the signs of a nation, or let's call it an empire, that is reaching a kind of a terminal point. And if we don't radically rechart our course, then the collapse is going to be very frightening and very chaotic.
In Empire of Illusion, which you wrote and published in 2009, you write, "Those captive to images cast ballots based on how candidates make them feel. They vote for a slogan, a smile, perceived sincerity and attractiveness, along with the carefully crafted personal narrative of the candidate. It is style and story, not content and fact, that inform mass politics."
Precisely, and the structure of the corporate state, as well as the imperial state, remains untouched. It doesn't really matter which political party holds office. The policies of George W. Bush have been assiduously carried out for the large part by Barack Obama. And even figures like Dick Cheney have confirmed this, whether it is the so-called war on terror, the refusal to restore habeas corpus, the eavesdropping, wiretapping, and monitoring of tens of millions of Americans, which under our Constitution should be illegal, passed for the FISA Reform Act, which Barack Obama supported, whether it is the looting of the U.S. Treasury on behalf of Wall Street. All of these are policies which are bipartisan. And that is because we have undergone, I think, in the last few decades, a kind of slow-motion coup d'etat, a corporate coup d'etat, whereby the citizen is rendered impotent, and it is solely the interests of corporations which are paramount within the circles of the power elite. I mean, one could take many examples, but Obamacare would be a good one. I share the right wing's critique of Obamacare. It's a disastrous bill. It was written by corporate lobbyists, 2,000 pages of it. It is essentially the equivalent of the bank bailout bill for the pharmaceutical and insurance industry, $400 billion in subsidies. Meanwhile, the White House handed out exemptions because these corporations do not want to insure chronically ill children. I mean, think of it in moral terms. It really means that we live in a country where it is now legally permissible for corporations, for-profit corporations, to hold sick children hostage while their parents frantically bankrupt themselves trying to save their sons or daughters. This is the kind of world the corporate state creates. And the Democrats and the Republicans are both handmaidens of corporate interests, which is why Congress has such a low approval rating. I mean, the American public's not fooled by this.
In 2010, Death of the Liberal Class came out. Here's a quote: "The election of Obama was one more triumph of illusion over substance. It was a skillful manipulation and betrayal of the public by a corporate power elite. We mistook style and ethnicity, an advertising tactic pioneered by Calvin Klein and Benetton, for progressive politics and genuine change."
Sure, Obama functioned as a brand. Now remember, 2008, the financial collapse, Wall Street was terrified. They thought they'd been found out. They thought they would have to pay a price for their criminal activity, fraudulent activity, and malfeasance. And Obama functioned as a brand in the same way that people of color or HIV-positive models were used by Benetton and Calvin Klein to associate their products with a risque lifestyle and progressive politics. But as with the function of all brands, we confused a brand with an experience. Obama won Advertising Age's top annual award, Marketer of the Year, because the professionals knew precisely what he had done. He beat Nike, Apple, Zappos. And that's what he was. He, to quote Cornel West, became essentially a black mascot for Wall Street.
One of the themes in a lot of your books is criticism of liberals. Why?
Because the liberal class was never meant to function as the political left. The liberal class was meant to function as the political center. And I spent a lot of time in Death of the Liberal Class going back to the radical and populist movements at the turn of the century, which were very powerful. Anarcho-syndicalist unions like the Wobblies, the old CIO, Eugene Debs, the socialist candidate for president, polled almost 6% of the vote, 900,000 votes in 1912. Publications like Appeal to Reason and the Masses, which were socialist publications, had wide circulations. Appeal to Reason was the fourth most widely read periodical in the country at the time before the war. And we had about 2 or 3 dozen socialist mayors. Well, what happened was the war itself. And Wilson had run for re-election in 1912 on the slogan, "He kept us out of the war." But with the collapse of the Eastern Front, with Tsarist Russia, the collapse of Tsarist Russia and the Bolshevik Revolution, there was the capacity of the Germans to send, I think, upwards of 100 divisions to the Western Front. And the bankers on Wall Street, who had lent tremendous sums of money to the British and the French, were terrified that if the British and French lost the war, they'd lose their money. So there was heavy pressure on the White House, aided by the Kaiser's decision to begin to try and create a naval blockade around Britain, which sank 3 or 4 American ships, to go into the war. But it had no popular support. And we created, and I spent a lot of time writing about this in Death of the Liberal Class, the first system of modern mass propaganda, the Committee for Public Information, known as popularly as the Creel Commission, because it was headed by a figure named George Creel. Now, the Committee for Public Information and the sort of dark figure, the Grand Inquisitor type figure, becomes Walter Lippmann, who ends up writing a Public Opinion in 1922, sort of the blueprint for control. Manufacturing consent is his phrase. And it's how you use propaganda effectively to manufacture consent. And you don't actually need the harsher measures of the Espionage Act and the Sedition Act, except for the most recalcitrant forces or radical forces. Randolph Bourne, Jane Addams, Debs himself ends up going to prison. But propaganda becomes, in the right hands, in the hands of the state, a much more effective tool to herd people where you want them. And the most important thing about the Committee for Public Information is that it drew on the understanding of crowd psychology or mass psychology pioneered by figures like Le Bon, Trotter, and of course Sigmund Freud. That people were not moved by fact or reason, but manipulated by emotion. And this system of mass propaganda, which created a kind of permanent fear of course, the Hun, was transferred the moment the war was over to the dreaded Red. And there's a great writer I like very much, Dwight MacDonald, who writes of this period, and he said, essentially the war, World War I, was the rock on which these movements broke. Now, this is absolutely vital to understanding what happened to American democracy, because these movements never took formal political power. And yet they were the true correctives to, in terms of opening up our democracy. The Liberty Party that fought slavery, the suffragists, the labor movement, and later the civil rights movement. These were movements that pressured the liberal class to respond. We saw perhaps the best example of it during the Great Depression, where you had figures like Roosevelt and his vice president, Henry Wallace. And these were liberals who responded to the plight of the underclass and made incremental and piecemeal reform possible. That's what the liberal class is supposed to do when it works. And Conrad Black, when he writes his biography of Roosevelt, said that Roosevelt's greatest achievement was that he saved capitalism, and Black was right. And what we've seen with the destruction of those radical and populist movements in the name of the Red Scare in the 50s, remember, with the McCarthy hearings, we saw thousands of university professors, social workers, journalists essentially purged from their positions. I.F. Stone, probably our greatest investigative journalist, becomes a non-person. He can't even get a job at The Nation magazine. And that was disastrous because we lost the pressure on the liberal establishment, and then in the name of sort of the battle against anti-communism, we hollowed these liberal institutions out from the inside. So that by the 1970s, let's say, there was no longer any bulwark to protect us from the corporate state. And we were transferred, I think correctly, in the words of the Harvard historian Charles Mayer, by the early 1970s, from an empire, what he calls a production, to an empire of consumption. We began to borrow to maintain both a lifestyle and a level of consumption, as well as an empire we could no longer afford. And that the impediments to that, which had been in place, were essentially removed. And you end up with what I would say are faux liberals, people who speak the language of traditional liberalism, like Bill Clinton, and yet serve the interests of the corporate state. So it's under a Democratic administration under Clinton that we get some of the most egregious assaults against the working class in this country. NAFTA, the greatest betrayal of working men and women in this country since the Taft-Hartley Act of 1948. The destruction of welfare. I mean, one of the reasons they keep extending unemployment benefits is because, courtesy of Bill Clinton, once those unemployment benefits run out and you do not have a job, you have to attempt to live on about $143 a month, courtesy of the welfare system. The deregulation of the FCC, so that you have Rupert Murdoch's News Corp and Clear Channel buying up literally thousands of stations, radio and television stations, consolidating it into one entity. The destruction of the banking system. Canada doesn't have a banking crisis. We have about 100 bank closures a year, but Canada has none because it didn't tear down that firewall put in place in the United States by the 1933 Glass-Steagall Act. It didn't tear down the firewall between commercial and investment banks. In short, it didn't allow gamblers or hedge funds to take over the banking system. This was all done under Clinton. And Obama comes in and essentially codifies the destruction of both domestic and international law put in place by the Bush administration, so that he doesn't restore basic civil liberties. In fact, he carries out a further egregious assault against them, the capacity of the executive branch to order the assassination of American citizens, this new Military Detention Act whereby people can be picked up if they are deemed in the nebulous term a terrorist and denied due process and held in military brigs. So I think that understanding the structures and the foundations of power and how they work is extremely important. And some great political philosophers like Sheldon Wolin, probably our greatest living political philosopher, in his book Democracy Incorporated, sort of spelled it out. And he calls it, the system we live under, inverted totalitarianism, by which he means that it's not classical totalitarianism. It doesn't find its expression through a demagogue or a charismatic leader, but through the anonymity of the corporate state. That in inverted totalitarianism, you have a system by which corporate forces purport to pay loyalty to the Constitution, electoral politics, the iconography and language of American patriotism, and yet have so corrupted the levers of power as to render the citizenry powerless.
Chris Hedges, back to your book, Death of the Liberal Class. You write that the creed of impartiality and objectivity that has infected the liberal class teaches, ultimately, the importance of not offending the status quo. The professionalism demanded in the classroom, in newsprint, in the arts, or in political discourse is code for moral disengagement.
Of course, because what you end up doing is paying deference to institutions like Goldman Sachs, which are criminal enterprises. You pay deference to power centers that have long ago walked away from responsible citizenship, whether it's coal companies in Appalachia, or whether it's chemical plants that are polluting rivers, or whether it's Wall Street. And I think that inability to make those moral judgments has rendered the liberal class not only useless, but despised by large segments of American society. And I think, frankly, they have every right to be despised because they posit themselves as sort of the moral voice, the conscience of the nation. And yet, I think have failed miserably. And my book, Death of the Liberal Class, is really an attack on the pillars of the liberal establishment. The liberal church, which I come out of. I'm a seminary graduate. My father was a minister, grew up in the church. The press, and I also come out of it, 15 years at the New York Times, over 20 as a journalist. Labor unions, which of course have withered, and now we're seeing a final assault against public sector unions, the last sort of readout of unionized activity in the United States. Culture, which has become commercialized junk largely, and education itself, which has become increasingly geared towards keeping people within their economic strata and giving them the vocational skills to serve the interests of the corporate state.
Chris Hedges, back to your most recent book, The World as It Is. First of all, how is that book organized?
It's organized around, these are essays. I write a weekly column for Bob Scheer's great website. Bob Scheer used to be the editor of Ramparts, and I'm a great admirer of his work and a great friend. Anyway, he runs this website, Truthdig, and I write a weekly column. So these are, over the last 5 years, some of the columns that I've written, and it's built around issues of the Middle East. I was the Middle East bureau chief for the New York Times. I spent 7 years in the Middle East. It's a region I know intimately well, and most of that time I'm an Arabic speaker in the Arab world or in the occupied territories. So I have a particular sensitivity to the pain, particularly I think of Palestinians, but also I think for many within the Muslim world, and I have spoken out quite strongly on their behalf. It's built around empire, and these are sort of the themes that I hit within my books, but also tend to hit in my weekly columns.
In the last column in the book, They Kill Alex, it's called. Who is Carlos Arredondo?
He's the father of a young Marine who was killed in Iraq. And it's the story of the pain of that family and the loss of that son. And I'm very sad to report that just a few days ago, Alex's brother, who was also a veteran, committed suicide.
What did the father do after he found out his son was killed?
He went to the van where the two Marine officers had driven to his house to inform him about the death of his son with a can of gasoline and lit it on fire.
In 2005, Chris Hedges, you wrote the book Losing Moses on the Freeway, The 10 Commandments in America. Who are or were Patrick and Tyrone?
Patrick and Tyrone. When I graduated from college at Colgate University, I moved into or across the street from a housing project in Boston, in Roxbury, the Mission Main and Mission Extension housing project, which at the time was one of the, since been raised and rebuilt, but at the time was one of the most dangerous spots in the city, a 60% vacancy rate. The street, I ran a small church there as a seminarian. I was attending Harvard Divinity School, but commuting into Cambridge to go to classes. And the street in back of my house, Gore, had the highest homicide rate at that time in the city of Boston. Patrick and Tyrone were two kids. They were heroin addicts. And I always say that my 2.5 years in Roxbury is when I learned to hate liberals. Because I was commuting into Harvard where everybody wanted to empower people they'd never met. They liked the poor, but they didn't like the smell of the poor. And the matching the rhetoric of this classic sort of liberal Christianity with the reality on the streets of Roxbury was a huge wake-up call for me. And I was, at the time, a member of the Greater Boston YMCA boxing team. We used to go down to Charlestown and fight for $25 a fight on Saturday nights. And I physically threw them off my street. They were pushing heroin on kids on the street. I actually caught them raping a 14-year-old girl and beat them up. And I don't say any of this with any kind of pride. It was a deeply troubling time for me. And I used all of the mechanisms of authority, which in many ways I had moved to Roxbury to defy, to make their lives miserable. I went to they were skipping schools, so I went to the truant officers. They had petty crime, had committed petty crime. I went to probation officers. I went to the police. They lived for a while in an abandoned house, and I would take out the fuses because they had rewired the fuse box. And then eventually at the end, they broke into my house and were waiting for me with lead pipes. And the reason they were unable to attack me is because another boy that I had been close to and tutoring, he and one of the guys I lived with had been tutoring in math, Stanley, found them. I saw the back window of my house broke in the manse and climbed in and informed me. But it was really earth-shattering period for me, because I realized in some sense, and I write that in the book, that I was the enemy. That when I was fearful and cornered, I reached out to the very levers of control that these people could never reach out to. That I had that ability to make the system work on my behalf because I was white and I came from privilege and I was educated in a way that they didn't. And I think that was a really important lesson for me in terms of white supremacy and white privilege and what it means. And I kind of bear it as a mark of Cain, and yet I did it.
While evangelicals often champion a gospel of greed and personal empowerment, liberals often speak on behalf of oppressed groups they never meet, advocating utopian and unrealistic schemes to bring about peace and universal love. Neither group has much interest in testing their ideologies against reality. Why did you leave Roxbury and the seminary?
Well, I went into seminary to be an ordained minister, and I became increasingly disenchanted with both liberal institutions like Harvard Divinity School as well as the liberal Presbyterian Church, which I came out of. That I felt that they paid lip service to the poor as well as lip service to values that in fact they were not willing to fight for. So it was a rupture with the institutional church, which was particularly painful because I had been raised within the institutional church. Not only was my father a parish minister for all of his life, but my mother as well was a seminary graduate, although went on to become a professor. So, it was a really difficult time. This was an institution that had nurtured me. I think I still speak and think in the way that it taught me. That is sort of ethically and finally perhaps even religiously. These are not values I've necessarily discarded, but I had at that point a huge schism with the institution itself. And I'd always written. I had been editor of my high school paper and all that kind of stuff, and had published in the Christian Science Monitor when I was in college, and very interested in what was happening in Latin America at the time. These were military dictatorships, Pinochet in Chile, the dirty war in Argentina, the death squads in El Salvador, this kind of stuff. And my second year in divinity school developed a friendship with a great journalist, Robert Cox, who had been editor of the Buenos Aires Herald. And Bob was an amazing man. He, at the height of the dirty war, would publish the names of the people who had been disappeared the night before on the front page, until he himself was disappeared, and was only saved because he was a British citizen, later knighted. Anyway, he was at Harvard, and that was for me a huge window into I think what journalism that had a kind of moral center could be. Bob's great sort of intellectual mentor was Orwell. And so I left divinity school. I would go back and finish, but I left to go to Latin America, studied Spanish with the Maryknoll Fathers in Cochabamba, Bolivia. And when I left, I took, on Bob's advice, the collected letters, essays, and journalism, that 4-volume set by Orwell that I carried with me through that whole year and read and reread and underlined into this day. I think for anyone who cares about writing and cares about journalism is a kind of secular Bible.
In that book, Moses, you write about your last night in Roxbury throwing a bottle at the church where you had served and then driving off. Are you still a Christian? Are you a Christian?
It depends on whose definition. The London Review of Books reviewed a book I wrote where I've been battling these new atheists, the late Christopher Hitchens and Sam Harris and Dawkins and others. And their judgment was that I was a non-believer. I would call myself certainly a non-traditional believer, but in the end still a believer in the core message of the gospel, in the Beatitudes. I mean, I find one of my frustrations with some of the right-wing evangelicals is this emphasis on law, which is a Hebraic concept. I mean, the Ten Commandments were not, they're a product of Moses. Let's put the Beatitudes up in courtrooms. I'm all for that. And I think that there was a transformation in terms of the theological outlook of the Christian gospel as opposed to what it went before. And it's a theological outlook that I embrace and admire and seek to live by. But in terms of polity, in terms of a particular denomination, whether they would consider me a good Christian, I would suspect most of them probably would not.
Good afternoon, Happy New Year, and welcome to Book TV's In-Depth program. This is our monthly program with one author looking at his or her body of work, and this New Year's Day 2012 author, journalist, and columnist, Pulitzer Prize winner Chris Hedges is our guest for the next 2.5 hours. We're going to put the numbers up on the screen if you'd like to participate. 202 is the area code, 737-0001 for those of you who live in the East and Central time zones. 202-737-0002 for those of you in the Mountain and Pacific time zones. And you can email Mr. Hedges at booktv@cspan.org or send a tweet. @BookTV is our handle, twitter.com/BookTV, and we'll get to those calls in just a minute. Mr. Hedges has been writing nonfiction now for about 10 years. He began with his National Book Critics Circle Award finalist book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, which came out in 2002. What Every Person Should Know About War in 2003. Losing Moses on the Freeway, 2005. American Fascists, 2006. And then in 2008, a book came out. It was originally called I Don't Believe in Atheists. It is now called When Atheism Becomes Religion. That's in 2008. Collateral Damage, also in 2008. Empire of Illusion, a bestseller, came out in 2009. Death of the Liberal Class was also a bestseller, 2010. And his most recent, a compilation of his columns from Truthdig, came out last year, The World as It Is. American Fascists and I Don't Believe in Atheists, or When Atheism Becomes Religion. Where did those books come from?
I think from the same place, actually. My frustration, part of my frustration with the liberal church is that they didn't call out the proponents of the gospel of prosperity. The idea that Jesus came to make us wealthy. The idea that Jesus, who was a pacifist, would bless the dropping of iron fragmentation bombs all over the Middle East is heretical. And the liberal church equivocated in the name of dialogue, in the name of tolerance, word, by the way, Martin Luther King never used. I think my anger at what had been done to a religious belief system that I admired and that I think is worthy of emulation. The infusion of the worst aspects of American consumerism and imperialism into the Christian religion, and the failure on the part of the liberal church to denounce it. And that doesn't mean I'm not against evangelicals. I in fact write in the book that the real opposition to the gospel of prosperity and this rapacious right wing that has seized an element of the Christian church will not come from the liberal church, but will come out of the evangelical movement, I believe. And so my frustration over what had been done, and then the same kind of cheap characterization of Christianity that was done by the New Atheists. They attack a form of or a caricature of religion that I also detest. But they can only attack that caricature. And I've debated both members of the Christian right and, of course, Christopher Hitchens in Berkeley and Sam Harris at UCLA, and they can't hear what I'm saying. They can only attack their caricature of who I am, and that's what the Christian right does as well. So if I am debating the Christian right as I have, then I am a proponent of godless secularism. If I am debating a new atheist, then I believe in magic and angels and miracles, which I don't. And I think that fundamentalism can come in secular form. It can come through the language of scientific rationalism. The political agenda of figures such as Hitchens or Harris is really no different from the Christian right, because they elevate Western civilization. So they are attacking the Muslim hordes because they're barbaric, whereas by the Christian right, they're sort of forces of Satan. But the result is the same. And what it really is at its core is a form of self-exaltation in both cases. It is about elevating me above everyone else, morally, spiritually, intellectually, and abrogating the right to impose what I define as a virtue by force on those who are different. And both the New Atheists do it and the Christian right does it.
And When Atheism Becomes Religion came out in 2008. It came out after public debates with Sam Harris and the late Christopher Hitchens. Mr. Hedges writes about the atheists, they see only one truth, their truth. Human beings must become like them, think like them, and adopt their values, which they insist are universal or be banished from civilized society. All other values, which they never investigate or examine, are dismissed. When were you with the New York Times?
1990 to 2005.
And why did you leave?
Well, we had a little dispute over something called the Iraq War. And I'd spent a lot of my life, not only, of course, in the Middle East, but in Iraq. I understood, like most Arabists, that the arguments used to justify the invasion and occupation of Iraq were non-reality based. This is not a political discussion. It's the idea that we would be greeted as liberators and there wouldn't be an insurgency, that democracy would be implanted in Baghdad and emanate outwards across the Middle East, that, remember, the oil would pay for the reconstruction. I mean, these were just spun by people who had no idea what they were talking about. And but to get up and say that, despite the wealth of experience that I had within the region and within Iraq itself, became deeply polarizing. And I gave a commencement address that I'd been saying it, but it came to a sort of a head when I gave a commencement address at Rockford College, where I was booed off of the stage, had my microphone cut. People stood up and started shouting things against me. At one point, they stood up and sang "God Bless America," and I was actually escorted off of the platform before the awarding of diplomas, since they didn't want any sort of fracas by close contact with students. And this got picked up by Fox and the sort of trash talk media, which looped it, hour after hour. And the New York Times responded by giving me a formal written reprimand. Now, we were guild at the Times, which means we're unionized, and the process is you give the employee a written reprimand, and then the next time they're fired. So I faced a difficult choice, which is that I would have to, in essence, muzzle myself in service of my career. But on a fundamental level, I was very close to my dad, who was a great minister and an activist in the civil rights movement, the anti-war movement, the gay rights movement. His brother was gay, and he was very outspoken in support of gay rights. I realized at that point that to do so would be to betray my father, and I wasn't going to do that, and so I left the paper.
And The World as It Is, Mr. Hedges writes, I have never sought to be objective. How can you be objective about death squads and El Salvador massacres in Iraq, or Serbian sniper fire that gunned down unarmed civilians, including children, in Sarajevo? How can you be neutral about the masters and profiteers of war who lie and dissemble to hide the crimes they commit and the profits they make? That's from his most recent book, The World as It Is. And now it's your turn, David, in Hobe Sound, Florida. You're on with Chris Hedges. Please go ahead.
Thank you, and good afternoon to both of you. You spoke of your admiration for Dwight McDonald. The only thing with which I agree with Leon Trotsky about is when he said that everybody has the right to be stupid, but Comrade McDonald abuses the privilege. Well, I'm glad that you're on so that America can see who writes for the New York Times. But get to the question I called to ask. You said while you were making speeches for one of your books that if we went to war with Iraq, you would not pay your taxes.
That was
Where do you get all
that? It was Iran, not Iraq. I said that if we went to war with Iran, I wrote an article for The Nation magazine that said I would not pay our taxes, my taxes. That's correct.
And what about his point about liberal journalists writing for the New York Times?
I don't think the New York Times at this point can be considered a liberal newspaper. Remember that it was one of the chief propagandists or cheerleaders for the war in Iraq. And had to write sort of a mea culpa afterwards. It completely missed the looming financial meltdown because instead of walking into poor neighborhoods where families were being given subprime mortgages that bankers and mortgage brokers knew they could never repay, and then of course these things were fraudulently diced up and sold as assets. They were running down and doing lunch with Robert Rubin. The New York Times, in the words of Sidney Schanberg, who also had a break with them when he tried to take on real estate developers who were friends of the publisher, papers like that are important in the sense that they stop things from getting worse, Schanberg says, and I think that's right. But this is, it sets very narrow parameters by which it operates. And the closer you get to the centers of power, the less established media institutions like the New York Times will take those centers on. The further you get from the centers of power, i.e. within the outer reaches of empire, the more latitude you have, which is why I spent most of my career very far away from Washington.
Next call for Chris Hedges comes from Lakeside, California. Mike, you're on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Hello, to both of you. C-SPAN's top notch. And I remember Mr. Hedges' book, War is a Force to Give Us Meaning, and writing that book back in that time era. Being the California, I can tell you, that was burly, dude. I just got a couple quick questions. Mr. Hedges' form of music, and has he ever heard of the science fiction author Frank Herbert, who wrote the Dune series, which is basically science fiction telling truthful tales about power? And my third question was, what do you think of the new trend in the pharmaceutical community to sort of blame everybody's genetic makeup for, character defects and that sort of corporate nexus?
All right, Mike, thank you for all those questions. Mr. Hedges?
Okay, I haven't read the Dune series, so I can't respond to that one. I think what the caller is talking about is something called biological determinism, the idea that morality is determined by biology. I would certainly say that biology has a heavy influence in how we respond. As somebody who has been repeatedly in war zones, I know that when you're afraid, as I have been, you start sort of thinking with another part of your brain, and yet I finally don't believe that biology is a prison. And that I would break with the biological determinists. I think that we do, perhaps not as much as we think, but we do have a capacity for independent action, and I have seen people sacrifice even their own safety or lives to protect others. And so I find the whole idea of genetic makeup or biology determining how we act and determining morality frightening, because I think it absolves us of moral choice.
In Empire of Illusion, at no period in American history has our democracy been in such peril or the possibility of totalitarianism as real. Our way of life is over. Our profligate consumption is finished. Our children will never have the standard of living we had. This is the bleak future. This is reality. There is little President Obama can do to stop it. It has been decades in the making. It cannot be undone with $1 trillion or $2 trillion in bailout money, nor will it be solved by clinging to the illusions of the past. That's what you wrote in 2010, I believe. 2009 is when Empire of Illusion came out. And this email we have received from Barlow Humphreys. I have read your books and continue to read your Truth Dig columns and understand the points you make when criticizing what is wrong with our government and country. I think they are brilliant. Listing problems and shortcomings is useful to a point. However, I would like you to list also those positive things that an individual can do to correct the problems you so clearly outline.
Well, I think that referring to the passage that you just read, if we don't radically reconfigure our relationship to the consumer culture, to the fossil fuel industry, and to the environment, we are finished. That the climate science is in, and we cannot continue to live as we have been living. This doesn't mean a diminished life. In fact, one could argue that breaking from the addiction of rampant consumption is spiritually healthy. That speaking to the rest of the world not through the language of violence, but through a regained kind of humility is something that is salutary. But the fact is, we must radically confront the destruction that humankind is carrying out against the ecosystem if we are to have any kind of sustainable future. So I think the work of Bill McKibben and others is extremely important, especially against this tar sands effort to bring this pipeline down through Canada, which I think Hansen calls the end game or something to that effect. I mean, that basically our chief, NASA's chief climate scientist, in essence saying it's over. And yet we're sitting by pretending it's not happening. We're shredding Kyoto. We've done nothing at Copenhagen, nothing at Durban. What can we do? Well, I'm a great supporter of the Occupy movement because I think that here people are carrying out acts of civil disobedience, understanding that within the system itself there is no way to halt corporate malfeasance and corporate criminality. And I have invested a lot of time in it, and I think that it's a huge sort of glimmer of hope.
Lucius Sorrentino emails into you, Mr. Hedges. The Occupy movement has been criticized for not having a political agenda, aim, or purpose other than creating an internet meme, the 99% versus the 1%, and drawing attention to the problem. What do you see as the future of Occupy Wall Street insofar as political activism goes?
I disagree that it doesn't have a message. I think the message is very clear. And the message is the corporate coup has to be reversed. The corporate overlords have to go. I covered the revolutions in East Germany, Czechoslovakia, and finally Romania. And we used to hear the same criticisms leveled against the organizers, for instance, in East Germany, that what are your demands? Well, the movement understands that there are certainly things that I think most people within the Occupy movement would support, revoking corporate personhood, campaign finance, a serious jobs program, especially directed at the young, a moratorium on foreclosures and bank repossessions, all of which I support and all of which I think are important, but they're not going to come as long as the political system is held hostage to corporate interests, as long as we live in what Sheldon Woolen calls this system of inverted totalitarianism. And so they keep it focused on the fundamental problem. And of course, the power elite criticizes the movement for not making specific demands, for not funneling this energy back into a dead system. And I think the most telling moment for me came when there was a coordinated effort by 18 cities to shut down Occupy encampments, including in Oakland, LA, New York. And for me, that was an indication of how tone deaf and out of touch those in power are. The idea that they could physically eradicate these movements and yet not address the injustices and suffering that had given birth to these movements. If they functioned as a liberal class should function, let's go back to Roosevelt and Wallace. If they were serious about attempting to save corporate capitalism, they would have immediately announced a $1 trillion jobs program targeted at people under the age of 25, a moratorium on on bank repossessions and foreclosures, and forgiving $1 trillion in student debt. I mean, these would have been the kinds of steps that might have been able to begin to ameliorate the anger, the legitimate anger that has gripped many, many, many Americans, and yet they think they can use militarized police forces, and I've been in the middle of it. I mean, it's just like being in a Star Wars movie. They're stormtroopers, in essence, command helicopters up in the sky. These are peaceful protests, directing traffic, instances of very brutal behavior, pepper spraying, beating. I was arrested outside Goldman Sachs. People were being slammed into the cement. To think that they can counter this by force, I think, is deeply misguided and shows how out of touch those in power are.
Next call for Chris Hedges comes from Seattle. Bob, thanks for holding. You're on Book TV.
Yeah, hi, Mr. Hedges. I really appreciate your work. When the former Soviet Union collapsed, the message that we received here was that capitalism was the victor. There was no alternative to capitalism, unbridled capitalism. And, of course, during the last Great Depression of the Roosevelt administration, communism was an active threat to the elites here. So possibly out of fear, the New Deal was enacted. Since there was a vacuum created by the collapse of the former Soviet Union, the elite, the people here had no alternative. So the elites, of course, no longer have any fear of the people because, of course, capitalism is the only answer. It's the victor. But let me ask you a question. Of your current crop of political people in this country, who would you pick as someone that could rebalance the equation here?
Okay, Bob, we got the point. Thank you. Mr. Hedges.
Well, first of all, let me talk about capitalism. I'm not actually, I'm not a Marxist. I'm not against capitalism. But there are different forms of capitalism. There's the penny capitalism of the farmers in the small farm town in upstate New York where I grew up, who brought their produce in and sold it. There's the regional capitalism of the local hardware store owner or small business owner who lived in the community, paid taxes, sat on the school board. Then there's corporate capitalism, and that I am against. That's something else. It's supranational. It doesn't care about the interests not only of the community but the nation state itself. It will tear down, as it has, trade barriers and drive production overseas. That's what NAFTA did, and of course now we're seeing large-scale factory closures over the border in Mexico as these corporations move to the cut-rate embrace of China's totalitarian capitalism, or Vietnam or Bangladesh, where people in sweatshops are paid 22 cents an hour, or even prison labor. And because of globalism, because of corporate capitalism, because the destruction of national boundaries, workers in this country and everywhere else are told that they have to be competitive on a global scale, which means being competitive with people who work in sweatshops or prison labor in China. And it's corporate capitalism that I find frightening. I'm a huge, in terms of political figures, I don't believe that given the configurations of our political system, we are going to mount a serious challenge to it through the electoral process. I think the challenge will come through the Occupy movements, and I don't think these movements are going away. When you covered the revolutions in Eastern Europe, you became very cognizant of that timetables were impossible to predict. Overthrowing the communist regime in Poland took 10 years. In East Germany it took 10 weeks, and in Czechoslovakia it took 10 days. No one really knows. These movements have a kind of life of their own, how they spring. I was in Leipzig on the afternoon of November 9th, 1989, with the leaders of the East German opposition. And they said, well, maybe within a year there'll be free passage back and forth across the Berlin Wall. Within a matter of hours, the Berlin Wall, at least as an impediment to human traffic, no longer existed. And that was a huge lesson for me, that even those most closely associated with these movements don't know where they're going, and oftentimes don't even know what their potential is. I put my faith in movements. I think Karl Popper in The Open Society and Its Enemies was right. The question is not how do you get good people to rule. That's the wrong question. Most people, Popper writes, who are attracted to power are at best mediocre, which is Obama, or venal, which is Bush. The question is how do you make those in power frightened of you? And that comes through movements. And the destruction of those movements, labor movements, all sorts of social movements, including communist unions, which were the first sort of integrated organizations in the country. Why great public intellectuals and artists like Paul Robeson joined them, because it was the only place a black man with any dignity could often go. These have all been decimated, and that has been catastrophic to our democracy. I think we have to put our faith back into movements, which of course is what the Occupy Wall Street is. It's a movement.
In the chapter Illusion of Wisdom, in the book Empire of Illusions, Mr. Hedges writes, our elites, the ones in Congress, the ones on Wall Street, and the ones being produced at prestigious universities and business schools, do not have the capacity to fix our financial mess. Indeed, they will make it worse. They have no concept, thanks to the education they have received, of how to replace a failed system with a new one. They are petty, timid, and uncreative bureaucrats superbly trained to carry out systems management. They see only piecemeal solutions that will satisfy the corporate structure. Their entire focus is numbers, profits, and personal advancement. They lack a moral and intellectual core. They are as able to deny gravely ill people medical coverage to increase company profits as they are to use taxpayer dollars to peddle costly weapon systems to blood-soaked dictatorships. The human consequences never figure into their balance sheets. The democratic system, they believe, is a secondary product of the free market, which they slavishly serve. Next call for Chris Hedges comes from Westport, Connecticut. Lois, you're on Book TV on C-SPAN 2. Good afternoon.
Good afternoon. So glad to see somebody like Mr. Hedges on C-SPAN. I feel strongly that the liberal media and the government work together, and by doing so, they both gain advantage. One instance that gave me this idea was a few months ago, there was an article by Bill Keller in the New York Times Magazine with pictures of Osama bin Laden and Obama on the bottom of that article. And since I assume that the media is corrupt and the government is corrupt, wouldn't it be good to expose this unspoken alliance? Couldn't that help our country? Thanks a lot.
Well, you've put me in the awkward position of defending the New York Times. I don't think it's quite that black and white. I don't think the New York Times is corrupt. I think that the New York Times is certainly an institution that whose a sort of unofficial credo, and I say as someone who worked within the institution for a long time, is do not significantly alienate those on whom we depend for money and access. That doesn't mean that they won't alienate them at times. I think the sin of the traditional media, like the New York Times, is more the lie of omission. Now, certainly they served as propagandists, rather naive and unwitting propagandists for the Bush White House in the lead up to the Iraq War, repeating all sorts of claims and putting things on the front page that we now know are untrue with very little vetting or, I think, journalistic integrity. And yet, I think that there are many people within the newspaper who care about news, who care about journalism, who care about truth, and the best reporters care finally about truth. And we talked earlier about objectivity and impartiality. When one feels for the suffering of those in Sarajevo, and I was in Sarajevo during the war, that doesn't give them an out in terms of speaking the truth and writing the truth, even about systems they may, or people they may empathize with. I covered, after the first Gulf War, I was in northern Iraq in the Kurdish-held territories, and I wrote very harsh articles about disputes, even armed disputes between Kurdish factions, corruption, cigarette smuggling, to the point where some of this stuff was even read by the propaganda broadcasts directed at the Kurdish territories out of Baghdad. And yet, as Orwell said, if you look at journalism as a product that we as journalists have to sell, what it is our credibility. That a lie may work in the short term, and a lie of omission is still a lie. But in the long term, it destroys you. So it's not incompatible to feel and also to speak the truth. And I think that the problem with the New York Times is not so much what it covers, but what it often doesn't cover. The fact, as I mentioned earlier, that in the buildup to the subprime mortgage crisis, they weren't out there in poor neighborhoods, that they gravitate towards the centers of power and leave the struggles and the suffering and the injustices that are visited, especially on the weak and the vulnerable, unheard. I think that the media has done a horrific job in terms of highlighting what tens of millions of Americans are enduring. I mean, the 47 million Americans who live in poverty now spend about 35% of their income just on food to eat. And yet they're largely invisible, especially on the commercial media. Now, we are seeing the rise of a non-reality based media. That's Fox News, cable news channels that are not rooted in verifiable fact. And this frightens me very much. Whatever the limitations of the New York Times, and they have them, and I've been very critical of them, including my book, Death of the Liberal Class, they are rooted in verifiable fact. That discussions are based around verifiable fact. And with the rise of so-called media outlets that discard fact, where opinion becomes interchangeable with fact, then you enter a kind of totalitarian state, because people are allowed to believe whatever they want to believe or whatever they are made to believe. And I see the kinds of attacks that are made by the right wing against the New York Times as not so much ideological. I don't think the New York Times at this point can be classified as a liberal newspaper. But I think it's much more pernicious, that what they're attacking is reality-based media and essentially trying to destroy it before they drop that sort of iron curtain of propaganda around all of us.
Mr. Hedges, from your first book, which was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award for Nonfiction, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, you write, "The enduring attraction of war is this: even with its destruction and carnage, it can give us what we long for in life. It can give us purpose, meaning, a reason for living." You go on to write, "The communal march against an enemy generates a warm, unfamiliar bond with our neighbors, our community, our nation, wiping out unsettling undercurrents of alienation and dislocation. War in times of malaise and desperation is a potent distraction." And finally, "Despite all this, I am not a pacifist. There are times when the force wielded by one immoral faction must be countered by a faction that, while never moral, is perhaps less immoral."
And I say that with a great deal of pain, because I know what violence does. I know the poison that it is. And yet, I was, as I said, in Sarajevo when it was being hit with 2,000 Serbian shells a day, constant sniper fire, 4 to 5 dead a day, 24 wounded a day, including 2,000 children being killed in that city. 45 foreign correspondents were killed there, dozens were wounded. And we understood, those of us who were in that besieged city, completely surrounded, that if the Serbs broke through the trenches, or literally they were defended by sort of World War I style trenches around the city, a third of the city would probably be massacred, and the rest would be driven into displacement and refugee camps. And we'd seen it in the Drina Valley, we'd seen it in Vukovar. We knew what the pattern was, we knew what the modus operandi was. And one understands when you are faced with the very real possibility of not only your own annihilation, but the annihilation of your family, your children, your community, how you pick up a weapon. Now, unfortunately, once you do that, you cross a line. You are not free from the poison of violence. And initially, those who organized the defenses in Sarajevo were gangsters. They came from the criminal class, Cello and others. And when they weren't shooting at Serbs across the barricades, they were raiding the apartments of ethnic Serbs in the city, looting them, and sometimes executing them. One of the reasons that I am such a strong and vocal supporter of the Occupy movement is because it is nonviolent. And the corporations know only one word: it's more. They will push and push and push until I want that reaction not to descend into violence. because I know what violence does. That violence, even when it is employed in ostensibly a just cause, as Nietzsche said, pits your monsters against their monsters, and then it just always becomes tragic. I don't believe in just war. I think sometimes human beings are pushed to such an extent that violence is inevitable, but the consequences for those who employ violence on both sides is catastrophic.
Next call for Chris Hedges comes from Lexington, Kentucky. Joe, thanks for holding. You're on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Hey, C-SPAN. Happy New Year to you guys.
You too.
Happy New Year, Chris Hedges. I watched you on Link TV. I like your stuff.
Thank you.
And just wanted your opinion on just your personal opinion on who actually controls our world. Who controls the world, Chris? Tell us. I know you know.
Well, I think the world's a big place, but certainly the most powerful entities are these huge corporations. Corporations like Goldman Sachs, for instance. Because I spent so much of my life in the developing world, places like Africa, Latin America, and the Middle East, just to give you a small example, I saw what happened when commodity futures were bought up by corporations like Goldman Sachs, and wheat, for instance, which it has in the last year, its price increased by 100%. I saw the human consequences of that, the children who were malnourished and even in some cases died of starvation because they couldn't afford to eat. The wars in both Iraq and Afghanistan have very little popular support, and yet for a handful of corporations, Lockheed Martin, Northrop Grumman, Halliburton, they're immensely profitable, as war is for a certain tiny segment of the power elite, and always has been. As Smedley Butler said, war is a racket. So I think that we unfortunately have created a world where power has become centralized in the hands of a select group of corporations that are more powerful than the state itself. It is within the American political system impossible to vote against the interests of Goldman Sachs. And unless we thwart that power, we are doomed, because corporations, unfettered capitalism, and Carl Polanyi wrote a great book about this in 1944 called The Great Transformation, turn everything into a commodity. In that sense, Karl Marx was right. I mean, unfettered capitalism is a revolutionary force. And human beings become commodities, the natural world becomes a commodity that you exploit until exhaustion or collapse. And that's why the environmental crisis is intimately twinned with the economic crisis. And if we don't somehow find a mechanism or a way to break the power of those corporations, they will continue to trash the ecosystem to the point at which life for huge segments of the human species will be unsustainable.
Chris Hedges, David Chow's emails into you from New York City. Do you see today's economic and political climate as somewhat resembling that which existed in Germany during the 1930s?
Well, Noam Chomsky, and I'm a great admirer of Chomsky, has made that comparison. I think in some ways, yes, it's always difficult to make those historical analogies because one has to be very cognizant of the major differences, including the massive war reparations, the defeat of World War I, the fact that Germany had no real tradition of a liberal democracy under its monarchy. But I think that there are some frightening similarities, the most important being a kind of Weimarization of the American working class, the disenfranchisement of working men and women. It used to be in this country, going back to the 50s into the 60s, that you could work in an auto plant or a steel mill and make a salary that would actually support a family and allow you to buy a small house and send your kids to college, and you had medical benefits and a pension plan, and all of that's vanished. That we have thrust our working class into the service sector economy, low wage economy. Households, not only do people tend to work within the working class more than one job, but almost everybody in the house is working in order to keep afloat. And that has been a devastating change. And I think one of the rise of the Christian right, as I argue in American Fascists, is directly linked to this despair. Because these economic dislocations bring with it destructions of communities, destruction of families, substance abuse, domestic abuse, all the attendant problems that come when communities break down, and people retreat from this reality-based world, which frankly almost destroys them, almost has destroyed them, into a non-reality based belief system, and all totalitarian systems are non-reality based belief systems. A world of magic, of historical inevitability, a world where God intervenes on your behalf. And I think the only way to bring these people back into a reality-based world is to re-enfranchise them within the economy. And I think this is something that we saw in Weimar. That it was despair, and all the great writers on totalitarianism, Hannah Arendt, Karl Popper, Fritz Stern, use despair as that starting point that drives people into these very frightening movements. And I think that despair is very prevalent within American society and very dangerous.
In his 2005 book, Losing Moses on the Freeway, The 10 Commandments in America, Mr. Hedges writes, "We watch impassively as the wealthy and the elite, the huge corporations, rob us, ruin the environment, defraud consumers and taxpayers, and create an exclusive American oligarchy that fuses wealth and political power. We watch passively because we believe we can enter the club. It is greed that keeps us silent." Susie in LA, good afternoon.
Chris, I want to thank you for your thoughts and your books. They're very deep, and they really open many of our minds to some very important concepts. And you really try, at least from my observation, to present a lot of deep thought and objective reality. I was troubled, however, in the area when you talk about the Middle East, because you talk about your history in terms of knowing Arabic and the people there. But I was wondering also if you had an equal knowledge of Hebrew and the people on that side.
Well, I lived in Jerusalem for 2 years. I don't speak Hebrew. That was a conscious decision, because when I worked in the Middle East, to be working in Syria or Baghdad and to speak Arabic and have any Hebrew words creep into your Arabic could immediately land you in prison, although I have to say that eventually in both Iraq and Iran I was thrown in prison anyway, or jailed for brief periods of time. I have a great admiration and affection for Israel, and I think that the parameters of the debate about the Middle East and about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in Israel are far broader than they are in the United States. My opinions are not particularly controversial in Jerusalem among most of my friends who sort of yawn and pour themselves another beer. But they are in the United States. The newspaper Haaretz, for instance, the Israeli newspaper Haaretz, I think, has probably the best coverage of the Palestinians of any paper in the country. And all of these articles are written by Israeli Jews. Danny Rubenstein, Amir Haas, Gideon Levy. These are really great journalists, and do Israel credit. So I think that the frustration for many of us old Middle East hands is that we saw possibilities in Oslo and in the relationship between Yitzhak Rabin and King Hussein, and I knew King Hussein and covered Rabin. And with the assassination of Rabin, we watched that hope essentially vanish, and Israel, as the United States has, essentially become captive to a really rapacious right wing. I mean, for instance, the Israeli Foreign Minister Avigdor Lieberman, who has openly called for the ethnic cleansing of Israeli Arabs and Palestinians. I mean, this was unthinkable when I first got to Jerusalem in 1988. And for me, it's really a debate about the health of the Middle East and the health of the Israeli state itself. I don't think that responding to a historical injustice through the use of force and occupation is, in the long term, productive for the state of Israel itself. Yet at the same time, of course, I adamantly oppose, and there are those within the Arab world who call for the destruction of the state of Israel. Most states, including our own, I spent a lot of time in Pine Ridge for a new book, were founded on historical injustices, but I think we have to work out, as we're being wanted to, an accommodation whereby which both peoples can live in dignity.
Chris Hedges, what is Pine Ridge, and when will this new book come out?
I've been working for 2 years with the comic artist Joe Sacco on a book called Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, that will be out in June. And we have gone to the sacrifice zones, the poorest pockets of the United States. Camden, New Jersey, which per capita is the poorest city in the country, also the most dangerous. Pine Ridge, South Dakota. It's a Lakota reservation where the average life expectancy for male is 48, the lowest in the Western Hemisphere outside of Haiti. We've worked a lot in the coal fields of southern West Virginia. And I mean, the destruction of the Appalachian Mountains is truly frightening. Instead of sort of burrowing for coal, they're just blasting the mountains into a moonscape, into rubble, destroying the water, destroying the air. None of this is going to come back. It's cannibalism. And then finally in the tomato fields and the agricultural fields in Florida with primarily undocumented, although not exclusively undocumented workers, to take, and the last chapter is Zuccotti. When we began the book, we did give it the title, Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, but the revolt was conjecture. And then towards the end of it suddenly flowered this movement, which became a kind of expression of what we felt would be a response. We didn't know what the response was going to look like, but we felt there would be a response, a popular response. And it's a look at what happens when you kneel before the marketplace. And when human lives, or the course of human life in human community, are determined by the dictates of the marketplace, and there are no impediments to corporate control, because these sacrifice zones are now expanding outwards across the country. I mean, roughly 1/3 of this country already lives in pretty extreme poverty, or certainly struggles, and that will only grow if the corporate state is not stopped, because their goal is to reconfigure, and we're already very far down that road, into a kind of oligarchic neo-feudalism, where you have a rapacious, moneyed, entitled elite which controls the economy, systems of communication, education, as well as political power, a sort of thin managerial class, and then 2/3 of the country are left scrambling to survive.
You're watching Book TV on C-SPAN 2's In-Depth program. Chris Hedges, author, journalist, Pulitzer Prize winner, is our guest this month. Mark in Sonora, California, good afternoon.
Hi, Mr. Hedges. We had mentioned earlier about going into, I think the other caller, I think he said Iraq, and we were talking about Iran. And I'm kind of wondering, what do you think would take for us to get into Iran? And then what do you think would be the advantages and the consequences if we don't?
Well, first of all, I covered Iran. I spent a lot of time there, including some time in Iranian jail cells. I was actually deported at one point in handcuffs. My best guess is that the Iranian regime is trying to build a nuclear weapon. But having come out of the Middle East and spent as long as I have in the Middle East, that doesn't worry me. What worries me is the transference of that technology to non-state groups. Iran has an address, and states that have an address are, I think, very unlikely to use those weapons. I think that Iran wants it as a defensive measure. I think they understand that if Iraq, for instance, had a nuclear weapon in the way that North Korea has nuclear weapons, the Americans would not have invaded. I'm not pretending to speak for the Iranian regime, but this is my assessment. I think Pakistan is probably, in fact, in terms of the proliferation of nuclear technology, more dangerous than Iran. And frankly, Pakistan is more unstable. Pakistan frightens me more than Iran does. So okay, will they eventually get a weapon? I suspect they will. I think attacking them would be deeply counterproductive. First of all, there are roughly 1,000 sites that have been picked out. Many of these are in highly populated areas, so the loss of civilian life would be catastrophic. Remember that Iraq is primarily Shia, and I think that an attack on Iran would be interpreted throughout the Muslim world as an attack on Shiism itself. 2 million Shiites in Saudi Arabia. Bahrain is primarily Shia. Shia minorities in countries like Pakistan itself. And I think then you would have a kind of conflict go regional. It is my understanding that the Iranians, if attacked, even if Americans are not directly involved, and it is primarily an Israeli attack, although I'm not sure that's possible because I think they have to fly over Iraqi airspace, they will obliterate any American bases, including the Green Zone, in Iraq, with, of course, heavy loss of American life. So I don't want to defend the Iranian regime. They're a pretty perfidious group. Yet at the same time, I think that attacking Iran would really be a disaster.
Chris Hedges, how'd you earn the honor of being handcuffed and deported from Iran? And if people wanted to read one of your books and hear that story, which book should they read?
I don't know that I put that story in a book.
Okay.
War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning has sort of the most personal accounts. It's a meditation on war, starting, it's not chronological, but it's a meditation on what war does to individuals and societies. And I draw from many of the conflicts that I covered, roughly a half dozen, from Sarajevo and Kosovo to the first Gulf War, where I was actually captured and taken prisoner by the Iraqi Republican Guard in Basra. And, you know, I've never gone back and reread it. It was such a painful book to write, so I can't tell you whether the Iranian story is in there. But in short, it's just a silly foreign correspondence story. We can fill up 3 hours of those if you want. But what happened was I was supposed to interview the president, Rafsanjani, and I went to get a visa, Rafsanjani, and I was supposed to get a visa, and they, at the embassy, I can't remember where it was, Bahrain or somewhere, they gave me a multiple entry visa by mistake. And so the Iranian official took white out and whited out the multiple entry and wrote like one visit. So I got to the airport very late at night, and these border guards, or the sort of customs police, accused me of forging the visa. So they locked me in a room at night, and I did precisely what you were not supposed to do, which was throw a fit, and actually broke chairs against the wall. And this is just juvenile behavior, but I did it. And of course, they got even angrier. And the next flight out was at 5 or 6 in the morning. It was a Turkish Airlines flight, and so these big guards came in and handcuffed me and took my passport and escorted me onto the Turkish Airlines flight. And by this time, I'd been 24 hours without sleep, so my eyes were sort of red and I was unshaven. And I had to go onto this Turkish Airlines flight in handcuffs. So of course, all the passengers thought I was, I don't know, selling drugs or something in Iran. And they gave my passport to the captain of the plane and said that I was not allowed to have my American passport back until I had reached Turkish airspace. So that is my...
Did he give it back to you when you hit?
He did. I also was in, that's not the only time I was in a jail cell in Iran. I was also picked up by the Caspian Sea, where I didn't have permission to be, and they have people's militias called Basiji, and so they captured me, and they decided to put me on trial in the morning, but they wanted to wait for a big crowd because it would be sort of a fun event, and they put me in a jail cell there, and I always carry a book with me, so I had Dostoevsky's The Idiot. I read 170 pages of The Idiot in an Iranian jail cell. And my translator was out there frantically and charmingly trying to get us out. And at about 2 in the morning, an Iranian police officer came, opened my cell door, said he would escort us to the limits of the province. And when we got to the limits of the province, we got out of the car, and I tried to give him money, actually. And he said, he said, I hate this regime. He said, now get in your car and drive all the way to Tehran and don't stop. And so I was spared the people's trial, which I'm sure I would have been found guilty of something.
Richard, Laurel, Maryland. Good afternoon. You're on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Thank you. I've had a question in my mind ever since 9/11 that never has really been. It has been addressed rather sparsely in the media, but Pat Buchanan on McLaughlin's show, and I'm going to paraphrase what he said, was that we need to realize that with the occupation of religious sites or sacred areas of the Middle East by the United States and the United States' support of Israel, these are reasons why 9/11 occurred, perhaps, and until we address those issues, we will continue down the same path.
Mr. Hedges.
Well, the caller raises an important and delicate point. What were the attacks of 9/11? Huge explosions and death above a city skyline as a peculiar form of communication. It was straight out of Hollywood. Where did these attackers learn this tactic? From us. When Robert McNamara began bombing North Vietnam, bombing attacks that would leave hundreds of thousands of civilians dead, he said it was, and I quote, a means of communication with Hanoi. And what happened on 9/11 was that those means of communication were brought home to us. 9/11 for me was one of the great tragedies, historical tragedies of our country, because the only way to fight terrorism, and terrorism has been with us since Sallust wrote about it in the Jukathan Wars, is to isolate terrorists and terrorist groups within their own societies. And you do that by garnering the empathy of those people in those countries where terrorist groups operate. And I covered Al-Qaeda for the New York Times, based in Paris, after 9/11. And we had garnered the empathy, not only of the world, but the Muslim world. Muslims were appalled at what had been done in the name of their religion. You had senior Islamic clerics like Sheikh Tantawi of Al-Azhar in Cairo denouncing 9/11 as a crime against humanity, which it was, and then going on to denounce Osama bin Laden as a fraud, somebody with no theological training or theological or religious legitimacy, and therefore no right to issue fatwas or religious edicts. And if we had the courage to be vulnerable, if we had built on that empathy, we would be far safer and more secure today than we are. Instead, we responded just as these terrorist groups wanted us to respond, and that was to begin by dropping iron fragmentation bombs all over the Middle East. The search for Al-Qaeda is not a war. You can't have a war on terror. It's a tautology. Terror is a tactic. It should have been handled by the intelligence community in the same way that Black September was handled by the Mossad, and even then innocent people died. They killed an innocent waiter by mistake at one point, I think in Sweden, but certainly not by conventional military forces. And so I think we played right into the hands of the very forces that we have been trying to defeat. 9/11 and Al-Qaeda were used as excuses to curtail democracy, civil liberties at home. We openly began to employ torture, not only in places like Guantanamo, but at our black sites around the globe, as well as against dissidents like Bradley Manning. And I think that there's been a frightening erosion of everything that we value and hold dear, and that we consider sacred. The people who perpetrated these crimes of 9/11 probably couldn't be happier.
Steve in Uniontown, Pennsylvania. Please go ahead with your question or comment for Chris Hedges.
Hi, Peter.
Hi.
It was only a few months ago I called in, and I got through, and when Michael Moore was there, and I suggested getting Chris Hedges on, and voila, here he is. I'm so powerful.
We'll give you the credit.
Thanks. Chris, a question about corporate personhood. they've used corporations have exploited the 14th Amendment so as to get more power. And I was wondering if it's possible, and this isn't facetiousness, the 13th Amendment outlaws slavery, right? So if these legal persons are owned by private people or shareholders, wouldn't it be possible to free the corporations from this ownership through the 13th Amendment and somehow to disempower them? And I'd like to see Cornel West on sometime. Thanks.
Well, that would be great if we had a judicial system that didn't serve the interests of the corporate state. And Citizens United is a clear example as to who the Supreme Court serves. It's not us, it's them. And I think the power of the Occupy movement is that it realizes that so many segments of our government and institutions, including much of the media, are just wholly owned subsidiaries of corporations. That we have to confront that power directly through civil disobedience, which includes the willingness to be arrested. That is the only hope we have left, I think, of affecting any kind of fundamental and real change. Appealing to the systems of power, including the judiciary, I think at this point is not going to work.
This is Book TV's In-Depth program, our monthly author program, where we focus on one author and his or her body of work. This month, it's Chris Hedges. For that last caller, Cornel West has done In-Depth, and you can watch that at booktv.org in its entirety. Just use the search function up in the upper left-hand corner. The producer of this program is Tanya Davis. Fargo, North Dakota. Ed, you're on with Chris Hedges. Hi.
Mr. Hedges, a speculative question. What might Mr. Blankfein, a recent chairman of Goldman Sachs, have meant when he responded to a question about Goldman Sachs' market activities by saying, I think I or we were doing God's work. I or we were doing God's work.
Thank you, Ed.
Self-delusion would probably be the first word that would come to mind. For me, figures like Blankfein and others should be put on trial for the activities that they have carried out. And I think the failure of a functioning judiciary to prosecute what are clear acts of fraudulent activity and manipulation of markets, the ability of these corporations to not only loot the Treasury, but now essentially borrow money without interest, while the rest of us are shackled in a kind of debt peonage. I mean, this is just indefensible in a functioning democracy, and you know, it's an odd situation to be a dissident or a critic and call for the rule of law. On the political spectrum, traditionally, those who call for the rule of law and the restoration of the rule of law are considered conservatives, and yet that's essentially what people such as myself are doing. I think it's the radicals who've taken power. Because that's essentially what we're asking for. We're asking for the application of law to be applied against all people impartially and fairly, and it's not being done.
Philippe emails into you, Mr. Hedges, interested in hearing your opinions concerning WikiLeaks, its antagonism with the New York Times, Julian Assange, and Bradley Manning.
Well, the New York Times, I wouldn't call it necessarily antagonism because, of course, they printed much of the WikiLeaks document. What you had was they took the information, and there was both on the editorial pages and even within the news pages a kind of character assassination of Julian Assange. I think WikiLeaks was, whoever leaked it, whether Bradley Manning leaked it or not, we don't know, but whoever leaked it exposed clear war crimes, including the killing of a Reuters journalist in cold blood and many civilians through that video where helicopters are attacking civilian vans. And I think that there is a moral imperative for those who see war crimes. I mean, this is what post-Nuremberg laws are about, to report them, even when they are they contravene security requirements. And this is what Daniel Ellsberg did when he leaked the Pentagon Papers. So I think that we can go back to the Pentagon Papers for an analogy, although I think the Pentagon Papers were probably far more destructive in terms of the release of that information to the wider public than anything that came out of WikiLeaks. A lot of the WikiLeaks stuff, and there's so much of it, I can hardly claim to have read all of it, but I read a lot of it, is just gossip, frankly. Cables and foreign leaders we don't like, and sort of embarrassing things that ambassadors said. Hillary Clinton calling on diplomats to spy on people at the UN, this kind of stuff. But within it was some significant information that I think should have been made public, so that we could begin to understand what has been happening in the conflicts in Iraq and Afghanistan.
We have an hour and a half left with Chris Hedges. He is the author of 9 nonfiction books beginning in 2002. War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning. 2003, What Every Person Should Know About War. Losing Moses on the Freeway came out in 2005. American Fascists in 2006. I Don't Believe in Atheists, which is now in its reprint called When Atheism Becomes Religion. That came out in 2008. Collateral Damage in 2008 as well. Empire of Illusion, 2009. The best-selling Death of the Liberal Class in 2010. And his most recent book, The World as It Is, came out in 2011. Well, every month when we have the author on, we always ask them about what they're reading, some of their favorite books and influences. As we continue our program, we want to show you that now. And we are back with our in-depth guest, Chris Hedges. Mr. Hedges, you are currently reading The Cross and the Lynching Tree by James Cone. What is that?
One of the most important books of theology of the last few decades. Cone's an amazing theologian. And this book is, which he spent 10 years writing, is a look at the utter failure on the part of white theologians in the white church to respond to the lynching of black men and women, the reign of terror in Jim Crow South. And he argues correctly that the failure on the part of the white church to understand that the crucifixion of Jesus was a lynching meant that it couldn't see the power of the crucifixion. And fundamentally, the message of the gospel itself within its midst. And it is really a stunning, stunning work. It's just filled with intellectual and emotional depth charges that whether you're a believer or not, you should pick up and read.
Melky Russell tweets into you, Mr. Hedges, can Chris talk about the issues a black man might face saying the same things you're saying to a white audience?
Well, look at what's happened to Cornel West when he has gotten up and criticized Barack Obama. He's been attacked roundly, including within the black mainstream media, to get up and speak an uncomfortable truth, as Cone has done throughout his life. Is to have a lot of people turn away from you, to turn their backs on you. I've spent over 2 decades of my life living among people who are not white, and I speak Spanish as well as Arabic and French. And it has been a long process as a white privileged male to begin to understand the reality of white supremacy, both as it manifests itself within the heart of the empire and on the outer reaches of empire. There are all sorts of assumptions that I can make that people who live in marginal communities and people of color cannot make. And it's important, I think, for those of us who come out of positions of privilege, and we spoke about the 2.5 years I lived in Roxbury, to put ourselves in these environments, because we're forced to confront our own blindness. And when you develop close relationships with people who suffer, whether they're Palestinian or whether they're African American in the inner city, when they become people you love and care about, and you see how entire systems are conspired against them, it becomes painful for you. But I think more importantly, you begin to see all the things that up until then you were unable to see, and that blindness, that there'll always be a kind of gulf between you and those who are oppressed. There will always be an inability to understand. You get as close as you can, you work as hard as you can, and then you accept your own deficiencies. And I think that very, very few people, one of the books you put up there was Litwack, the historian, who's really a remarkable historian, wrote a trilogy of books that I'm about to start. I teach in a prison I'm about to start in a couple weeks, and I'm teaching those 3 books. And it's the aftermath of the Civil War, Reconstruction, Jim Crow, and then he wrote a beautiful sort of thin essay, contemporary essay called When is Free Free? But very few, Howard Zinn had it, but I think very few people manage to cross those lines. And it really takes a lot of time, a lot of effort, a lot of work, and a lot of self-reflection and self-criticism.
202 is the area code, 737-0001 for those of you in the East and Central time zones, 202-737-0002 Mountain and Pacific time zones. BookTV at cspan.org is our email address. @BookTV is our Twitter handle. Angela in Farmington, California, you're on with Chris Hedges.
for taking my call. Can you hear me?
We're listening. Please go ahead.
Thank you. Oh, C-SPAN, good show, Mr. Hedges. You and others like you are the lighthouse in this foggy world. Can you be so kind? Mr. Obama, who is a constitutional attorney, is disheartening that bill he signed to detain someone on suspicion. It is most troubling. Can you lend an opinion, please? It is very, very disheartening. Thank you.
Well, I think one of the tragedies of the Obama administration is that here you have a chief executive who's clearly intelligent. He's trained as a constitutional lawyer, and yet he's done so little to not only defend our constitutional rights, but reverse the assaults against constitutional rights that were put into place by the previous administration. Obama clearly understands where the centers of power lie. He knows that in order to remain in office, he must serve those centers of power, but sadly, it's opportunism, it's careerism. He has decided to betray the majority of the citizenry in order to accrue for himself the perquisites of power. But he's done so at our expense. And this is the tragedy. I think on many levels, Bush was probably clueless. I don't think Obama's clueless. And in some ways, that makes him even more guilty.
Mr. Hedges writes in Death of the Liberal Class, 2010 is when that book came out. The election of Obama was one more triumph of illusion over substance. It was a skillful manipulation and betrayal of the public by a corporate power elite. We mistook style and ethnicity, an advertising tactic pioneered by Calvin Klein and Benetton, for progressive politics and genuine change. John is in Chicago. John, you're on Book TV.
Yeah, Mr. Hedges, it's so nice to listen to you. I do feel that you disparage the democracy in the United States. I've been working on the South Side of Chicago for about 50 years, and I think the progress that has been made in my area of the world is substantial, and it's been done without revolution and in a democracy. And I feel that Obama has all sorts of problems, and yet at the same time, I think that he is a leader of significance. And I'm sorry that you seem to be against democracy as it's being practiced in the United States now.
Well, I wish democracy was practiced as it should be in the United States, and I certainly feel that I, as a writer and a citizen, am fighting as hard as I can to reinstate democratic prerogatives and democratic rights that have been taken from us, not simply by Obama. This has been something that's been going on for a while. But I think we have to restore power to the citizenry by wresting it away from corporations, and I do believe Obama has been complicitous in the diminishing of our rights and of our political power.
Next call comes from Anchorage, Alaska. Sharon, you're on Book TV on C-SPAN 2 with Chris Hedges. It helps if I push the button. Sorry about that, Sharon.
Am I on now?
You are.
Okay, good afternoon. I want to go back to your book, Days of Destruction, and ask you, do you make any mention of the Chinese in Africa? I'm interested in your thoughts on this issue.
Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt is not come out yet. It's coming out in June, and it is focused solely on the United States. So we don't write anything about Africa. Joe Sacco and I are profiling what's happening internally within the United States.
Mr. Hedges, we're getting a lot of emails, tweets, and on this topic, and so I wanted to have you address it. This is from Empire of Illusion, 2009. Universities have trained hundreds of thousands of graduates for jobs that soon will not exist. They have trained people to maintain a structure that cannot be maintained. The elite know how only to feed the beast until it dies. Once it is dead, they will be helpless. Don't expect them to save us. They don't know how.
Well, there you go. That's the Occupy movement. We are the people we've been waiting for. And I think the power of the Occupy movement is that they understand that political truth, that the elites aren't going to save us. The elites are, through probably the most sophisticated system of mass propaganda in human history, and they're constantly taking our pulse and having focus groups and finding out what we think so they can parrot it back to us. That's what the public relations industry does, and does very well, to manipulate our emotions. I think that those who have gravitated toward the Occupy movement understand that the elites essentially serve interests that are not our interests, and that it is incumbent upon those of us to get out and carry out acts of civil disobedience if we are going to protect those interests.
Next call for Chris Hedges comes from New Milford, Connecticut. George, you're on Book TV.
Hi, Mr. Hedges. I'd like to ask you about, you mentioned Smedley Butler a little bit ago. Could you talk a little more about General Butler and his role in the 1930s plot to seize the White House? And also, if you could speculate on why we know so little about that plot and about General Butler himself. Thank you.
Well, Butler, who I think served 33 years and 4 months or something in the U.S. Marine Corps, after the war began to reflect. I think we have a current figure, Andrew Basovich, who was a colonel in the military, also engaged in that kind of reflection after he left service, began to look at why interventions were carried out, on whose behalf they were carried out, and Butler writes that he commanded units that invaded the Dominican Republic to make it safe for sugar interests, and Cuba to make it safe for banking interests, and wrote this pamphlet, which isn't very long, quite powerful, called War is a Racket, in which he lays that out. And it's also interesting, as you point out, a kind of historical footnote is that in opposition to Roosevelt and the New Deal, there were industrialists, powerful industrialists, Henry Ford and others, who essentially wanted to carry out a coup d'etat. I'm not 100% on the Henry Ford thing, so I'd have to go back and check my history books. But certainly powerful industrialists that tried to recruit Butler to carry out a coup, and he exposed them.
Chris Hedges is our guest. Gretchen Fallon from Arlington, Virginia, emails into you. I'd like to thank you for helping me with your writing to navigate these last several bleak years. I met you during Desert Storm Shield. You were interviewing my Marine Corps husband, a battalion commander. In particular, I thought you were clear-eyed and unsentimental in seeing that the people in uniform were honorable, smart, savvy, and often far more skeptical of coming conflicts than their civilian masters. The beat goes on: Iraq, Afghanistan, and so much more. How can our leaders continue to be so out of touch? Gretchen Fallon, Arlington, Virginia.
Well, a huge fan of her husband, Colonel Fallon, who commanded a Marine Corps battalion that I spent a lot of time with, 1st Battalion, 1st Marines, and that went into Kuwait, was one of the first battalions that went into Kuwait. And when the military's good, they're really good. And when they're bad, they're really bad. And in the Marine Corps, sort of the extreme example of that. When they come in like Colonel Fallon, they're remarkable men. I remember after the war, I remember two moments. Colonels are sort of isolated figures within battalions, and so we talked a lot. And I remember one time he asked me because I never sort of like to interview anybody above the level of Lance Corporal. The higher up you get the food chain, the more sort of spin you get. So I tend to, like Ernie Pyle, stay with the lower ranks. But he once asked me, what do my men think of me? And I said, Colonel, to be honest, they don't really like officers, but they all say Colonel Fallon cares about his men. And he got choked up. And at the end of the war, he had 7 wounded, one of whom pretty seriously. And I told him, I said, having spent weeks and weeks with you, I think you're a really great commander and a great leader. And he said, I got all my men home. And on that level, he's a Vietnam vet. In some ways, you go to people like that, and there's no one who hates war more than they do, the good ones. And they want to take all their men home. And because of my relationship with the Marine Corps, I spoke to about 250 colonels and lieutenant colonels on the eve of the Iraq War, and got up and gave this long, hour-long talk as to why this thing was really not a good idea. And all of those people, because they were putting their men on the line, because it's them who pay the price, there was no disagreement. They understood this was folly. They did their duty, but they knew it was insane. And you saw Shinseki and a few other military leaders at very high levels walk out of this program because of that. So the idea that somehow the military is a monolith, or that you don't have figures like Colonel Fallon, and having spent time with the military, I have tremendous respect for them. And I think in some ways we've done a terrible disservice to them. I mean, the idea that somehow it's a volunteer force and therefore they ask for what they get. We have plunged thousands of families in this country into perpetual grief and loss. And for what? We don't have a right to do that. We don't have a right to do that to these men and women. As I said, I'm not a pacifist, but you only go to war as a last resort, as a final imperative, because the costs are so grave. And so that comment from Gretchen means a lot to me because I'm a great admirer of her husband.
Why did you choose to make the speech at Rockford College in 2003? Why did you choose that college? Why did you choose then? Did you know what the reaction was going to be?
No, I didn't. I had been saying similar kinds of things for some time. My book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, had come out that fall, and so inevitably I would be asked about the impending invasion of Iraq. Now, if I was a good careerist, I would have dodged the question, but I felt that was morally not permissible. The only thing I knew about Rockford College is that one of my heroes, Jane Addams, had graduated from there. I didn't know that subsequently the trustee board had posthumously tried to revoke her diploma. So I thought, oh, well, they're just all pacifist socialists like Jane Addams. No wonder they invited me. And got up there and ran right into the buzzsaw. So no, I wasn't at all prepared for what I had to do. It was very uncomfortable. You can watch it on YouTube. To be booed and hissed by a crowd, and at one point have people actually climb up on the podium and try and push me away, and then be attacked over and over, hour after hour. And yet, someone said to me, one of my friends said, well, maybe you should have given the average follow your dream speech, or maybe you should have tried to moderate it. I got about 5 or 6 letters from students there who thanked me for what I was doing, and I always said, you know what, I was really only talking to them. That's it, everyone else I don't care about. So I think I did the right thing. I paid a price for it. I mean, nobody likes to lose their job, and I lost my pension and my medical benefits and all. I paid a price for that, of course, but war is not an abstraction to me, and without being melodramatic, I've lost friends in these conflicts. And I will go back there, and I want to at least go back from these zones of privilege and comfort that I live in, and be able to say that I did everything in my power, however futile it was, against these conflicts. And I hope that, maybe I'll have earned the right to ask for their forgiveness.
Who is Eunice?
My wife.
You dedicate several of your books to her, and you've taken to writing it in Latin, the dedication. Why is that?
Oh, because I think it's beautiful Latin poetry, and it's a kind of, except for I suppose Latinist, it's a kind of code between me and her. She's almost a co-author, I have to admit. She's an actor, but she's a great writer, and everything I write is filtered through her hands. I mean, there are pages in Empire of Illusion that are basically she wrote, several pages.
Two Harbors, Minnesota. Sam, go ahead with your question or comment for Chris Hedges.
Yeah, Chris, thank you for taking the call, but I'm wondering if you have any opinion about what corporate America has done to the Native American and our culture. The fact that they are all living on poverty-stricken reservations, and then on the other side they have these multi-million-dollar casinos that they're running sometimes in some of the states as well. I was wondering what your opinion on that was.
Well, it's the idea that gambling, and this is just outside of reservations, but I think within the country at large, that somehow gambling is a form of development. You see, of course, a big push now to build casinos in Philadelphia. I live in Princeton, so I'm following that debate. It's about an hour away. And this has worked for a few Indian tribes. So there's an Indian tribe in Connecticut it's worked very well for. But like there's one casino that nobody goes into on Pine Ridge. Pine Ridge is a pretty desolate, bleak area. If you look at the totality of Indian casinos, they've actually not been particularly lucrative. You have a few sort of sterling examples where people have actually been able, or tribes have been able to make money. But Pine Ridge is it's the second poorest county in the United States. At any one time, 60% of the people on Pine Ridge are living without electricity and running water. It is really, I mean, you almost have a hard time believing you're in America, frankly.
Chris Hedges, Mark Peterson emails into you. I'm a great admirer of what you're trying to do. As a historical liberal, I find myself perplexed at passion I feel for the Ron Paul candidacy.
Ron Paul, for me, is a sort of funny guy. I mean, he says a lot of good stuff. But for me, libertarianism is sort of a pre-industrial ideology. The idea that government should be so diminished. Well, I mean, the problem is that government is anemic in the face of corporations like ExxonMobil and Citibank and Goldman Sachs and Bank of America. And we need to find leverage by which these monopolies can be broken up and the power of these corporations can be curbed. And so I think Ron Paul is pretty good in terms of empire, in terms of fiscal responsibility, in terms of constitutional rights. But the core of his message, which is essentially to gut government, is one that I think isn't going to do anything to diminish the power of the corporate state.
This is from Peter Eggenberger, another email. Your claims about the way the U.S. is run seems plausible, but hasn't it always been run along similar lines since 1776? Furthermore, haven't elites always run societies?
Yes, and I think that one could argue that the battle for American democracy has been one long battle against those elites. That, you know, the Native Americans, African Americans, women, men without property, none of these people were invited to the constitutional conventions. It became a battle to open up American society, and these radical movements did that. So none of these radical movements achieved political power, but they were potent forces that the power elite had to reckon with. And I think the destruction of those movements has disempowered us. I mean, one could argue that in April 1960, the most powerful political figure in the United States was Martin Luther King. Johnson was scared to death of him. A year before, King had denounced the Vietnam War. And that's because when King went to Memphis, 50,000 people went with him. And I think we have to rebuild those movements. For those of us who care about democracy and care about justice, it's not our job to take power. You know, Julian Benda wrote a really great book, a French intellectual, called The Treason of Intellectuals. And he said that, you know, we have a choice in life. We can serve privilege and power, or we can serve justice and truth. And those of us who commit to serving justice and truth, the more we make concessions to those who serve privilege and power, the more we dilute the possibilities of justice and truth. And I think King, Malcolm X, Frederick Douglass, Randolph Bourne, Jane Addams, Eugene Debs, Mother Jones, you know, all of these people are figures that didn't make those concessions. And they never achieved formal positions of power, nor frankly did they ever strive to achieve formal positions of power. But they defended the interests of the dispossessed.
This tweet from NYC118 for you, Mr. Hedges. What do you think of Oprah's role in the culture and religious pursuit of personal wealth?
Negative. Oprah peddles this fantasy that we can have everything we want if we just focus on happiness and grasp that we are truly exceptional and dig deep enough within ourselves. And this is just magical thinking. It's not just peddled by Oprah. I don't want to pick on Oprah. The Christian right does it. Hollywood does it. Corporatism does it. Tony Robbins, self-help gurus do it. And it's just a myth. And frankly, it's a myth that's used to beat up on the poor. So there are no jobs in Camden. They used to make Campbell's soup in Camden. Even that's gone. Everything's gone. The schools are dysfunctional, gigantic dropout rate. The streets are unsafe. And to somehow tell a poor black child who's not getting an adequate education, not being raised in an environment that provides safety and security and nurturing, and upon that being tossed out into a city where there is no work, that they have to dig deep enough within themselves, is really a way for us to turn our backs on the vulnerable and the poor, and to say, you are responsible. This is what the cultural message is. You are responsible for your fate. And that's just the way the corporate state wants it, as it sheds job after job after job, as larger and larger segments of American society are reduced to subsistence level, without any kind of job security, without any kind of adequate health insurance, that it's sort of their fault because they haven't managed to tap into their inner strength. This is not only delusional, but in the end, I think, callous to the weak and the poor and to the working class.
Does Campbell's have any presence left in Camden?
Yes, they have a kind of international office, but it's a completely gated community. So you take the train into Camden, you get on a Campbell's bus, you go through the gate, and you don't go out again. So they have a presence, but they don't make soup there anymore.
Glenn, Freeland, Michigan. Good afternoon. You're on Book TV on C-SPAN 2.
Thanks very much. Mr. Hedges, some people now say the Holocaust is a lie. At the time, at least, some people had the excuse of saying they didn't know because there was no television and internet and stuff like that. Now, with what's going on in Syria, you can see the torture and the atrocities and all that kind of thing. And the peaceful protesters, they're carrying signs that say the old, I guess it comes primarily from the Holocaust. All it takes is for good people to do nothing, and evil people will triumph, or whatever exactly it is. I don't know exactly what you should do, but when you see some of this atrocious stuff coming out of Syria in particular, and some of these other Arab nations going on now, don't you think we should be, I mean, I'm not talking as some trigger-happy armchair warrior or anything. I was against the Iraq war.
Glenn, what's your question?
Don't you think there's something more we could be doing in situations like Syria now?
Well, I supported the intervention in Bosnia. I was much more skeptical about the intervention in Libya. We became embroiled in a 6-month-long civil war in Libya. Hundreds of people, thousands of people perhaps died. We don't know the actual count. Once you stop using cruise missiles and sophisticated weaponry like that, you inevitably have civilian casualties. I think intervention in Syria would probably not be quick or easy. And in terms of loss of life, as we saw in Libya, may in fact drive up the body count. The problem with Syria, as is the problem with Libya, is that they are sort of the Ceausescus of the Middle East. If you remember in the revolutions in Eastern Europe, the Polish government eventually built a kind of coalition with Solidarity. Erich Honecker in East Germany and the communist regime went down, as it did in Czechoslovakia, relatively peacefully. There was violence, but not as we saw in Ceausescu, where Ceausescu sent down troops and murdered thousands of people in Timișoara, which is the city where the rebellion began. And I think in Libya and Syria we've seen the same kind of recalcitrance on the part of the regimes, that they're quite happy to kill their own. And it's really tough to know how to respond. But I think Libya is an example of perhaps how we don't want to respond in Syria. What we have to do is put as much pressure as we can on the outside, but I think becoming embroiled in a Syrian civil war is not astute.
About 50 minutes left with this month's in-depth guest, Chris Hedges. For what did you win the Pulitzer?
It was I was part of a team of reporters that won the Pulitzer Prize for our coverage of Al-Qaeda. And I was based in Paris, and I covered Al-Qaeda in Europe, not in Germany, I don't speak German, but in the rest of Europe, including London, Britain, and the Middle East.
And he is the author of 9 nonfiction books. His most recent book is The World as It Is, a compilation of his columns from Truthdig, and his newest book will be coming out in June. Will that also be published by The Nation?
Yes, with Joe Sacco, who's done some amazing stuff, including Footnotes in Gaza.
Tassari in Queens, New York, you're on. Happy New Year.
Happy New Year. Thank you for what you do, sir. I appreciate what you said about men of privilege fighting for social justice. One such man, Mr. John Brown, who back in 1859 died along with his 6 sons for the cause of freedom and against slavery. Fast forward a couple of generations, and an Argentinian doctor went to Cuba to fight also for freedom. And I think in today's world, no matter where you are, what color your skin is, we can all see truth and we can all see injustice. And here in New York, there's a stop and frisk policy that plainly violates the Fourth Amendment. However, it's only brought against young, poor, black, and Latino men. And I think whatever your color is, as human beings, as Americans, we have to stand up for the Constitution, or for the spirit of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, that says God gives rights to men that men cannot take away. And again, thank you for what you do, and we would really appreciate you to help give voice to the stop and frisk movement in New York City against the violation of the Fourth Amendment.
Well, I've already told Carl Dix and Cornel West that the next time they go up and get arrested at a stop and frisk event in Harlem, I'll join them. So I've got a court date on January 20th for my arrest in front of Goldman Sachs. So I want to ration my court dates, but after I go to court, I'll get arrested again.
Was that as part of the Occupy?
Yes, Cornell and I did a people's hearing of Goldman Sachs in Zuccotti Park, where it was broadcast live by WBAI, the Pacifica station in New York, where we had people who had lost their homes, lost their jobs, come and testify, and then several hundred of us marched to the headquarters of Goldman Sachs, and then a group of us sat down and linked arms and were arrested in front of Goldman Sachs.
I don't know if you read your erstwhile newspaper this morning or not, or saw the picture of Zuccotti Park. Any reaction to that picture and that story about the park? It was barren, and now they're checking bags.
Right. Well, I mean, the foolishness of these corporate forces is they think that they can physically push people out of these spaces and the problems will go away. The problems aren't going to go away. The movement's not going to go away. And how will it manifest itself in the future? I don't know. None of us know. But because they refuse to address the core issues that have driven people into public spaces around this country, hundreds of public spaces around this country, because their only response is essentially draconian forms of police control, then they're in for a really long fight, and I hope they lose.
Vince Williard emails into you, Mr. Hedges. I have read Empire of Illusion 3 times, probably one of the most important books that I've ever read. I have read Death of the Liberal Class, also an excellent book, dispels quite a few myths of what it means to be a liberal. My question to you is this: do you agree with Morris Berman in his assessment that America is a failed experiment and that it will be necessary for the U.S. to collapse as a capitalist system for us to move on?
I would agree with Morris in the sense that we are in the process of collapse. The looting of the U.S. Treasury. I mean, the figures that are coming out that the New York Times reported, the trillions of dollars that have gone into Wall Street, which they've used for these obscene bonuses and swelling corporate profits. This is our money. And it should have gone to those people who are bearing the price and the cost of their malfeasance, and it's not. unless there is a radical redirection, then I think that collapse is, I'm too good a reporter to predict the future, but collapse is a possibility. I mean, let's look at the banking crisis in Europe and the Eurozone. Hypothetically, we see a lot of, they're bleeding money out of Greece, out of Italy, because they don't trust the system. Well, countries like Italy and Greece are in a terrible bind, because if they go back to their own currency, then their banking system will go under. And in order to go back to their own currency, they'd have to shut down the banks for a week or something. And you can be damn sure that by the time depositors showed up at the bank windows, what they had in euros would never equal what they were being given in drachma or lira. And the political ramifications of that could be immense. We still have a very disturbing, bubbling right wing within countries throughout Europe. And I'm not saying that's going to happen, but it's certainly not beyond the realm of possibility. The problem with the financial meltdown of 2008 is that we never reformed the system. They're right back doing the same kind of speculative activity that they were engaged in before. And look, in the 17th century, speculation was a crime and speculators were hung. It was a capital offense. And now they run the government and run the economy. And we have no way of controlling them. So it doesn't look good because we've not addressed the core problem. And that is somehow that money is real, that we can destroy our manufacturing base and can make money by betting. Well, in 2008, $17 trillion, mostly in the form of small holdings by people who had 401ks and pension plans and money they'd saved for college vanished, evaporated, and $40 trillion worldwide. And if speculators retain control of the global economy, then it's pretty certain it's going to happen again.
In your book, Empire of Illusion, 2009, The End of Literacy and the Triumph of Spectacle, you have a chapter where you visited Las Vegas for a month, or for a while. What chapter is that?
On the porn industry. And
Illusion of Love.
Yeah. And I get very angry with the liberal class on the left over their refusal to condemn pornography. Why is it morally indefensible to physically abuse a woman in a sweatshop in the Philippines or in southern China? But somehow it's an issue of free speech when it's done by the sex industry in the United States. When I started interviewing these women who came out of the porn industry, having suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder, I instantly, after literally a minute or two, said, all these people all have PTSD. And I wrote it graphically and brutally, and I think it intended to engender a kind of disgust. I never write in the chapter we should or shouldn't ban porn. I just said, if you want to defend porn, then you better understand what it is you're defending. These women, and they're just thrown up, they last 1 or 2 years on the sets, and then, if they continue within the industry, they just, in essence, become call girls, shipped around the country in hotel rooms, and it's just awful. But they're popping handfuls of painkillers before they go on the sets. This violence, which sells, and porn it's not the soft-lit porn of the Playboy channel anymore. It's so-called gonzo porn. The violence is not simulated, it's real. These women are black and blue by the time they finish. They are constantly going in for surgery for anal and vaginal tears because they're penetrated by 2-3 dozen men in the course of an afternoon, knocked around, abused, insulted verbally, assaulted physically. And I was, as somebody who doesn't watch porn, I was pretty blown away. It was really sick. And I end the chapter, because the only emotion that women on porn sets are allowed to express is a craven desire to be degraded physically and morally, physically and verbally and morally. And I end the chapter 2 ways, talking about these $7,500 silicone dolls which are anatomically correct and people take home and buy Victoria's Secret clothing for. And because in essence, porn is really finally about necrophilia. And if you look closely at the images out of Abu Ghraib, they all look like stills from a porn film. The pornification of culture, and especially the young. Most of the viewers of porn on the internet are between the ages of about 13 and 18. It's a completely pornified culture. And I think that in this, boy, I stand with the right wing on this. I mean, I think it is a symptom of deep moral degeneracy and an utter failure on the part of the so-called liberal class to stand up for the values it purports to espouse. It won't take a stand against it.
We are talking with Chris Hedges on In Depth. He was just discussing his book from 2009, Empire of Illusion. Our next call comes from John in Las Vegas. Hi, John.
Happy New Year. It's a wonderful way to start the new year. Listening to Chris Hedges, a very reasoned and reasonable man. But Mr. Hedges, I would imagine your life experience, especially as personified by your appearance at Rockwell, must lead you to the conclusion that no matter how bright we are, the man is not really a reasoning creature, but an emotional creature, and just uses his mind to justify his prejudices. And I think the most perfect example of that is your former friend Christopher Hitchens. I mean, for Christopher Hitchens to look at Henry Kissinger and his involvement in the assassination and murder of the democratically elected socialist Salvador Allende in Chile and conclude that he is a war criminal, and then to look at the more egregious behavior of George Bush and his lying us into Iraq and the murder of thousands of Iraqis and the murder of Saddam Hussein, and conclude he is not a war criminal, and the fact that Christopher Hedges would totally belittle anyone who remotely questioned 911 leads me to the conclusion that even the sharpest mind can be dulled by prejudice. Now, we've lost that very sharp mind. Perhaps Christopher Hitchens had already lost his mind before he died, and I just appreciate your comments.
Well, as somebody who has lived in disintegrating societies, I would certainly agree that human beings are not particularly rational. Freud got this in Civilization and its Discontents, written on the eve of World War II, where he talked about two forces, both within the individual and within the society. One being that force of eros, of love, of nurturing, of protection, of life, and the forces of thanatos, the death instinct, that instinct to annihilate all living things, including finally ourselves. And that these two forces are in eternal conflict, both within the individual and within societies at large, and that whole societies can be gripped by forces of thanatos. I think the Serbian society was at the end of the war. They giddily sort of embraced their own self-destruction and death. I think if you look at the end of Nazi Germany, there's a wonderful movie, Downfall, that I think captures it, this German film on Hitler's bunker. Yeah, it's brilliant. But it captures that kind of, having lived in those kinds of environments, it captures that kind of intoxication with death and longing for it. I don't think human beings are rational. My struggles with Hitchens were that he, when he was on the left or the right, there was never any nuance for him. He had been a former Trotskyite, and he swung all the way over and became a confidant of Paul Wolfowitz and the neocons. He bifurcated the world into blacks and whites, us and them. And unfortunately, that is a vision of reality that the closer you get to the ground just doesn't hold up.
How would you describe your relationship with Mr. Hitchens over the years? Friends, adversaries?
Deeply antagonistic.
Deeply?
Yeah.
In your book, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, you write that war finds its meaning in death. The cause is built on the backs of victims portrayed always as innocent. The dead become the standard bearers of the cause, and all causes feed off a steady supply of corpses. Mr. Hedges, what's the worst place you've ever been, or the worst situation you've ever been in?
There have been moments, of course, where I thought it would be killed. So, I mean, but those were moments. In terms of a place, it would be Sarajevo, because there was nowhere to hide. You sort of have to come out of the military to understand what it was like, because you have to know the weapon systems that were being used against us. 155 howitzers, 90 millimeter tank rounds, Katyusha rockets that are fired in bursts of 12 or 24 and can take down a 4 or 5 story apartment building in a matter of seconds, killing everyone inside. This was the kind of heavy ordnance that was being lobbed on top of us 24 hours a day, and coupled with the sniper fire. So it was like being in a, in a kind of, it was like being a rat in a cage. I mean, you couldn't get out, and you were constantly being zapped, and it had the same kind of psychological effect where it just ground you down. It was really, your nerves break. I mean, combat units know this. I mean, you can't keep, I think it's, they did studies in the military that after 30 or 60 days of continuous combat, 98% of the unit will have become psychologically impaired, and the 2% that aren't were psychologically impaired to begin with. In other words, you stay that long in a situation like that, you inevitably go insane, which is why combat units are rotated out of conflict. I mean, courage is never a constant, despite all these John Wayne movies. And that was true with Sarajevo. It just ground you down in a way that in El Salvador you would go out into conflictive areas, but you came back to the relative safety of the capital, San Salvador. In Sarajevo, there was no safe place to be.
In your book, I Don't Believe in Atheists, also known as When Atheism Becomes Religion, the belief that we can achieve human perfection, that we can advance morally, is itself an evil. It provides a cover for criminality and abuse, a justification for murder. It sanctifies war, murder, and torture for an unattainable absolute.
Yeah, the idea that time is linear. That's peculiar to both the Hebrew and the Christian Bible, which was adopted by the Enlightenment. The idea that we're getting better and better, that human progress is inevitable, is a myth. The Greeks, most Asian cultures see time as cyclical. That you have both within the individual and within civilizations a time of birth and maturation and decay and decrepitude and death. And I think history bears that out. I don't think there's anything in human history or human nature to justify the idea that we are advancing morally as a species. That doesn't mean we don't make moral advances. We do, but we also make moral reverses. And I think what we've done is equate technological progress with moral progress, and that's very dangerous. That technology is an instrument that serves the ambitions of humankind. But I don't think human nature changes very much. And this being lulled into this false belief that science or technology will, for instance, save us from global warming is essentially the modern equivalent to the ancient religious sects that people adopted as Easter Island was decimated and the environment essentially destroyed to a point where it no longer could sustain a human population. And I think we have to wake up that there is nothing inevitable about human progress, that it's far more important that we face and confront reality and deal with it. And if we don't, if we keep this naive belief, in essence, technology is sort of serves what in medieval times would have been God. And unless we shake ourselves free from that, we're in very big trouble.
In your book, The World as It Is, the creed of objectivity killed the news, and you quote Molly Ivins in here, and I just want to read just a little bit of that. This is Molly Ivins writing. I have heard many an editor say, well, we're being attacked by both sides, so we must be right. Stems from the curious notion that if you get a quote from both sides, preferably in an official position, you've done the job. In the first place, most stories aren't two-sided, they're 17-sided at least. In the second place, it's of no help to either the reader or the truth to quote one side saying cat and the other side saying dog, while the truth is there's an elephant crashing around there in the bushes.
Well, she got it. And that's why programs like The Daily Show or Colbert are so popular, because they poke fun at this absurdity of balance, where you get one lying pundit from the right and one lying pundit from the so-called left, and some cynical, overpaid news celebrity sitting in the middle, who knows that both are lying through their teeth and refuse to say anything. And I think that that is a kind of betrayal of the viewer or the reader. That it's our job as journalists, insofar as we can, to tell the reader or the viewer the truth, however unpleasant that truth may be, and however it may cost us in terms of popularity. And I think journalists are, if you go into that profession and you're looking for popularity, you're in the wrong profession. We should have a kind of constant antagonism to power. Whoever's in power, I don't really care where it comes from. Figures like I.F. Stone or Orwell are sort of my heroes because of that. And these were not impartial people. These were not people who didn't have strong opinions, but they understood that the truth was sacred. And Orwell, like Stone, they were quite willing to anger their leftist support. I remember Homage to Catalonia, Orwell's great memoir of the Civil War, included a chapter where he was an anarchist. He was fighting with the POUM, and the communists, the Comintern, the Stalinists came into Barcelona and gunned them all down. And Orwell put it in and published the book while the war was still going on. It only sold 600 copies during his lifetime, but it was, Orwell said, the power of the short-term lie is just not something I'm going to engage in. And in the long term, the truth has to be told, even if it ostensibly hurts a cause. Now, Orwell was shot through, almost killed on the Argonne front, shot through the neck and wounded fighting against the fascists. And yet he wouldn't lie on behalf of the Republicans. And that really is the gold standard. So these people were not in the way of sort of commercial journalism defined in any way as objective or impartial, but they told the truth.
Chris Hedges is our guest this month on In Depth. We have about a half an hour left. Frida in Albany, California, thanks for holding. You're on the air.
Oh, thank you. Mr. Hedges, I'd like to know what your thoughts are on slavery, blacks in America, and reparations for the oppressed black population. I think something similar to the Marshall Plan would be in order.
Well, the civil rights movement was a legal victory, but it was not a victory in the sense that Martin Luther King and Malcolm X defined it, because they knew that if there was no economic justice, there could never be racial justice. And I think part of the power of the Occupy movement is that it picks up where the civil rights movement left off, that economic justice is the only way to finally overcome racial injustice, that for the bottom two-thirds of Americans, that the civil rights movement pulled about a third of the African American community into the middle class. But remember, if you look at the statistics, now as the bottom is falling out on the middle class, it's African American families that are suffering disproportionately, even within the middle class itself. And I think one could argue that for the bottom two-thirds of African Americans in this country, things are worse than they were when King marched in Memphis or Birmingham or Selma. And so we as white Americans have a special responsibility because of the long night of slavery, the destruction of families, the destruction of religion, the destruction of language, the destruction of culture. Even their names were taken from them, in the same way that Germany has a kind of eternal responsibility for what was done to Jews during the Holocaust. And we have walked out on that responsibility. The best schools in this country should be in cities like Camden. The most intricate systems of familial and especially childhood support and medical care should be in the poorest aspects of this country, because these are people who have had the least chance to go anywhere. And one understands very quickly when you spend times in places like Roxbury or Camden, all of the institutions that work to keep the poor poor. Rents in cities like Camden are staggeringly high. Any kind of ability to sustain yourself within the informal economy, which often revolves either around, and families are split. You're either working for the police or in the correction system, or oftentimes you're on the street trying to make money selling drugs. the prison industrial complex and what it has done to African Americans, as the great poet Yusuf Komunyakaa has written, the cell block has replaced the auction block. And that's part of the reason I teach in a prison, because these people have had no chance. And they know that when they get out and they apply for a job, even if they can find a job to apply for, they have to check that box saying they were a felon, that they're stigmatized, that they can't vote, they can't get loans, their credit rating is destroyed. The last time I taught there, I taught American history. What I did is bring in copies of Howard Zinn's People's History of the United States, which fortunately nobody in the prison vetted, and taught it when Zinn is particularly conscious of what African Americans have suffered throughout American history. But I mean, there were days I just walked out into the parking lot of prison and just wept, because there were so many great minds, so many great kids that tend to be young, who thirst for knowledge, who wanted a life, and I understood, but more importantly, they understood all of the walls that had been built around to deny them that. So I think when you use the word reparations, I think yes, not in terms of maybe cash checks, but in terms of building social programs. Lyndon Johnson made a step towards this, towards bringing these people back into the embrace of the country as a whole.
Chris Hedges is the author of 9 nonfiction books. In 2002, War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning came out. What Every Person Should Know About War in 2003. Losing Moses on the Freeway came out in 2005. American Fascists, 2006. When Atheism Becomes Religion, 2008. That's when Collateral Damage came out as well. Empire of Illusion, 2009. The best-selling Death of the Liberal Class in 2010. His most recent, The World as It Is, came out in 2011, and coming out in June 2012 is
Days of Destruction, Days of Revolt, that I'm doing with the great comic artist Joe Sacco. So a lot of it, 50 pages, will be illustrations and comic panels.
And if people want to read your writing or read about you, what's the best website?
Truthdig. I don't have a personal website, and I don't tweet.
Why?
I'd rather read books. I think that there are too many distractions offered, these kind of virtual hallucinations. In order to think, you need quiet and solitude. You can't have anything in your ear, and you can't have somebody tweeting you, that they're going downtown to go eat.
At some point, you will need to develop your own website?
No. I don't. That's all about the culture of self-promotion, I think, and it's something that I really want to guard against. I mean, I don't have a television. I try and read every night for 2, 3, 4 hours.
Putney, Vermont, you're on with Chris Hedges. Go ahead, Jack.
Hey, Chris, you're amazing to listen to. You and Richard Wolff, between the two of you, take up a lot of my time listening. I'm going toward the environment. I got a list here of a million things, and I can only have a short time. So we're running out of time. You know it. Yeah. I know it. The people that know it really know it. We've been trying to tell them since the 70s. The environmental scientists first brought out the issue of it was acid rain originally. The progress is pretty grim. When you look at what we just did down in Durban, it's almost criminal, the response of the United States in terms of not taking any leadership and putting this thing off. When you have scientists around the world saying, we only have a short period of time here to get going on this, or we're going to tip to the other side and not be able to bring it back. Somehow, and how are we going to do it? We need to take this from corporate. And I bet you're a Marine. Were you a Marine?
No, I spent time with the Marines. They did make me boot, I will say, Colonel Fallon. Which, if you're a Marine, you'll know what I'm talking about.
Jack, very quick.
Out of the 60s.
Jack, very quickly, if you could wrap this up.
Anti-Christian, anti a lot of things. And I'm looking at Crazy Horse here on the wall, that monument yeah, okay, I'm wrapping it up.
All right, Jack, tell you what, we're going to, a lot of comments there on the table, and we'll get an answer from Mr. Hedges or a comment from him as well.
Well, when we talk about the giddy intoxication with with a death instinct. I think the self-denial or self-delusion around global warming is terrifying, because you have two responses equally self-delusional. One is that it doesn't exist. You had 50 members of Congress sign this thing when they came in that global warming doesn't exist. Or you have the self-delusion that somehow we can adapt. We'll just plant palm trees in Chicago kind of thing. And the fact is, if we don't break the back of the fossil fuel industry, and carbon emissions have gone up this last year, we're cooked, we're finished. I mean, even if we stopped all carbon emissions today, temperatures would still rise by many estimates to about 550 parts per million, 350 parts per million being what throughout the human history has sustained the human species. It is the book Empire of Illusion, the subtext is the end of literacy and the triumph of spectacle. It is the triumph of spectacle. What are we? Our emotional and intellectual energies are diverted to what? The Kardashian. I can hardly keep up with it. The Kardashians or Anthony Weiner's boxer shorts, or it's just every week there's something else. And it's, go back and read the end of ancient Rome. Cicero, inveighing against the absurdities of a Nero and of the Colosseum, and the investment of emotional and intellectual life into the arena, and look at the entertainment industry, the way sports, professional sports, college sports, celebrity culture has essentially, they flicker like the images on the wall of Plato's cave, and we're unable to see that the world's on fire. And so I think the caller is right, that it really is that dire, it really is that serious, and yet the culture of celebrity and the culture of spectacle and the culture of illusion is so powerful and is disseminated in so many ways that we're anesthetized.
A couple of related emails here. This is from Paul Appel, and we have another one here from Shepard Nakbar, and they're both talking about their grandchildren. What is the most effective action an older dispensable war vet can do to help his grandkids have a better life? That's Paul Appel. And then Shepard asks, I want to give advice to my 13-year-old granddaughter. What country should she be thinking about emigrating to live a happier, more moral, and productive life? Canada, Costa Rica, Singapore, Norway, other?
Well, Canada just walked away from the Kyoto Accords because of the tar sands, so I'm not sure Canada anymore. I don't want to go anywhere. I want to save this country. My family's been here for a long time, 1633. There's a lot that I love and care about, and I think it's worth fighting for. So get up and fight, and that's going to mean civil disobedience, and it's going to mean the discomfort of being arrested. And I think for me, the really great moral voices, Wendell Berry being one, Cornel West and others, have made this decision. I think Wendell Berry is about 77, beautiful poet, writer, moral philosopher. And he went and occupied, over the destruction of the beloved Appalachian Mountains in Kentucky, the governor's office. And as he went in there, he said, going to jail is more time than I really care to donate to the U.S. government, but he did it. And I've been arrested here in Washington and New York, and probably be arrested again, and it's not fun. Bill McKibben was here, arrested in front of the White House. Bill's another person I respect a lot. And went to jail for 52 hours, and I think that's what we have to do, because because of my background and because of what I've seen and experienced, I'm deeply committed to nonviolence, and I think that in order to make a better world, we have to put our bodies on the line, peacefully, respectfully, through acts of civil disobedience, to challenge what I think in theological terms could be called these corporate systems of death.
When you're on the front line like that, or with somebody like Cornel West, well known, are you treated with a deference, or are you treated differently at all?
Yes.
Do people know who you are?
Yes, I am treated with deference. And when I was arrested in front of Goldman Sachs, everyone was cuffed in front of the cameras except for I was not cuffed. And the police inspector who was running the operation told the patrolman not to cuff me. I did get cuffed, but not in front of the cameras. I got escorted to a paddy wagon, then I got cuffed. That's public relations. So I don't know if that's deference or astute public relations.
Hyattsville, Maryland, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Mr. Hedges, I think your work is wonderful. You talked about the media and how they don't like to intimidate the power centers, but there's one story out in foreign policy that is not covered, and I think is really terrible. The United States supports a whole lot of dictators and thugs, some of which come back to haunt the U.S. And I would think that there ought to be a national conversation. Is it in American interest to be supporting all these dictators?
Well, I think you saw that in the Middle East, the way the American government clung to Hosni Mubarak until the last minute, deeply angered an Egyptian population that was looking for genuine democratic reform. Whose interests, are they promoting? They're not promoting the interests of their people, and they're certainly not promoting the interests of genuine democracy. And yet they're reliable allies in the quote-unquote war on terror and against the rise of Islamic fundamentalism or Islamic radicalism. But the war on terror has just become the new mantra in the way that we supported all sorts of very heinous dictators in the war on communism, including figures like Ceausescu or Somoza in Nicaragua or Pinochet in Chile. And it becomes a kind of very simplistic way to deal with the world, and I think ultimately in ways that are to our detriment, because standing up for human rights. I mean, one of the things about being in Latin America during the Carter administration was that Carter actually tried to take human rights seriously and alienated the junta in Argentina, the military junta in Bolivia, where I was living at the time. Somoza himself turned away weapon ships. And so the governments of Latin America were screaming sort of bloody murder and denouncing Carter as a traitor. And yet when you walk through this, only time in my life really, except for maybe in the revolutions in Eastern Europe or in Iran, which is on the street, probably the most pro-American country in the world, that I go through the street and people lauded me because I was an American. And I think that determining foreign policy based on commercial or corporate interests is not only morally wrong, but misguided. And winning the hearts and minds of the populace itself is a far more effective tactic. But unfortunately, foreign policy is dominated by these interests, and both military force and diplomatic policy largely sees itself as making host countries amenable to corporate domination.
American Hero tweets into you, glad to see someone looking at Camden, New Jersey. It's like a city under occupation by some outside forces, referencing your upcoming book. This email from Gary Hamill in Stroudsburg, PA. Quick two-part question. Why is the political right much more articulate and effective than the left in communicating their political philosophy to the working class?
Well, that's a good question. And I think it's because traditional liberals in this society are hypocrites. They speak in that kind of feel your pain language, Clinton being a good example of that. Obama does it too, and yet assiduously betray the interests of the poor and working men and women. And that hypocrisy is not lost on the working class and on the poor. They see it, they understand it, and it enrages them. And they have every right to be enraged. They have every right to feel betrayed. And that's why I think the Occupy movement is an important movement, because it begins to speak about issues of economic justice, and it holds the Democratic Party and the traditional liberal establishment accountable for the destruction of those forces that once made it possible to be a working man and woman in this country and live with some kind of financial security and dignity. And those people who present themselves as liberals within the society are essentially traitors to those interests. And that's why the right wing captures that and mobilizes it, because frankly it's true.
In Death of the Liberal Class, Chris Hedges writes, Obama seduced by power and prestige, is more interested in courting the corporate rich than in saving the disenfranchised. Asked to name a business executive he admires, the president cited Frederick Smith of FedEx, although Smith is a union-busting Republican. Smith, who was a member of Yale's secret Skull and Bone Society, along with George W. Bush and John Kerry, served as Senator John McCain's finance chair during McCain's failed run for the presidency. Smith founded FedEx in 1971, and the company had more than $35 billion in revenue in the fiscal year that ended May 2009. Smith is rich and powerful, but there is no ethical system, religious or secular, that would hold him up as a man worthy of emulation. Such men build fortunes and little monuments to themselves off the pain and suffering of people like somebody you referred to earlier, Henderson. North Platte, Nebraska. Ann, go ahead with your question for Chris Hedges.
Yes, Mr. Hedges, you are truly a truth sayer, and I have two things I'd like to throw out there. One is that I keep hoping it's not true, but I have come to believe that the elections and voting is just an exercise in futility. It's like theater, and it doesn't make a difference. And somehow or other, we're supposed to believe that it gives us a voice and that by voting we can make a difference. And the other thing is that I'm a disabled grandma who would love to be part of the Occupy movement. But in the heart of ethanol country, there is no Occupy movement. And what could I do individually without transportation somehow to make a difference?
Thank you, Ann.
I think it is political theater. I think that's the problem. Just about every campaign promise that was made in 2008 by Barack Obama, whether it was filibustering the FISA Reform Act or closing Guantanamo, restoring civil liberties, he's failed us upon. And that's why I think that this movement and civil disobedience are the only weapon we have left, peaceful, nonviolent civil disobedience. It's not what we do with life, it's what we do with what life gives us. And, we all have limitations and struggles. You have personal limitations, and you shouldn't beat up on yourself for what you can't do. You do what you can. We change the world, I think, one person at a time. That's why in the Christian Gospels, the concern for the neighbor is absolutely paramount, especially for the neighbor who is poor, dispossessed, suffering. That's what the story of the Good Samaritan is at its core. It's about is the person who's left beaten on the side of the road. And I think it's within your circle, when you see that kind of suffering, reaching out in any way that you can to ameliorate it, becomes an act that is not only one, finally, that is about compassion and empathy, but I think in the state of affairs of America, even a political act.
Mr. Hedges, who else is there to stop the wars and the banks but Ron Paul? If the U.S. lasts that long, who are we to vote for? And I ask that in the sense of how closely are you following Iowa, and what do you think of the process, the whole process?
Well, I try not to follow it. I don't really care what Newt Gingrich said or what Mitt Romney said, nobody's talking about issues, frankly. Ron Paul talks about issues, but for the rest of it, it's just vacuous garbage for the most part, and I just don't want to fill my head with it. The whole Republican primary has just been sort of the march of the trolls, one troll replacing another week after week. I think we'll probably end up with Mitt Romney, who's as soulless as Barack Obama and as captured to the interests of corporations as Obama is. I think there are aspects to Ron Paul's ideology that I find disturbing. I think that, as a previous caller mentioned, there should be heavy state intervention into impoverished areas, not only in our inner cities, but in rural enclaves where poverty has become tremendous. Much of my own family comes from rural areas of Maine. Food deserts, supermarkets closed down, loss of employment, tremendous suffering, and I, in that sense, am a believer of the. I lived in Switzerland, and I saw a state, certainly not in any ways a perfect state, but one where everybody had health insurance, where there was no homeless. Now, tax rates are very high, 40 or 50%. It has one of the best public education systems in the world. Senior teachers earn as much as doctors. This is more towards the kind of society that I would like to see us build, where we distribute our resources so everyone has a chance. Look, I spent a lot of time with military units, and the best military units never leave their wounded or dead on the field, even corpses. They still mean something. They're not just commodities, although their utility to the unit, I suppose, could be argued is gone. And I've seen soldiers and Marines crawl out and bring these bodies back. And these were always the units with the highest morale and the most effective fighting capacity. It's the units who left their wounded and dead on the field and walked away that rapidly disintegrated. And I think that's what we're doing as a nation. We need to rebuild that solidarity, that community, that sense that when you stumble and fall, I will reach down and help pick you up if we're going to make it. And I think we have allowed corporate values, whether it's through reality television. I mean, reality TV is essentially about corporatism. It's about the celebration of values that are characteristic of psychopaths: self-aggrandizement, incapacity for remorse or guilt, betrayal. One builds false friendships and then betrays them. For what? For fleeting fame and a little money. And it's just writ large throughout the whole culture. And we have to begin to question our value system if we're going to make it. And I think one of the most important questions is, what are we going to do about all those people that we've turned or allowed to be treated like human refuse?
Eric Tremont emails into you from Albany, California. Although my politics are far to the right of Mr. Hedges, I do think that Death of the Liberal Class is a very interesting book. In particular, the book's blistering critique of higher education resonated with me. I am curious, was this critique prompted by Mr. Hedges' personal experience in trying to land a job in academia?
I've never tried to land a job in academia. I have taught as a visiting professor at places like Princeton, Columbia, New York University, University of Toronto. Although I will admit that I'm pretty clear I probably would have great difficulty landing a job in academia. No, it was more prompted by my deep love of the humanities, a belief that people need to be taught not what to think, but how to think, and understanding that true intellectual activity is by its nature subversive. Plato understood this. It's about questioning structures and assumptions, the withering of the liberal arts, which frightens me. We see, like, University of Albany has budget cuts, so it closes the classics department, its foreign language departments, theater departments, and everybody is sort of trotted off towards major in economics. The rise of for-profit universities where they don't even teach humanities. This is, I think, very frightening because it robs us of a vocabulary and robs us of an ability to critique the systems around us, and we all end up serving systems. We're trained how to serve these systems, which is what happened in 2008. A figure like Lawrence Summers, who had been the Treasury Secretary under Clinton, came back to the Obama White House. It's about funneling. He sees the bubble implode, and he funnels hundreds of millions, trillions of dollars of taxpayer money to reinflate that bubble because they only know how to serve a dead system. They don't know how to critique it.
El Paso, Texas. Jack, we have a few minutes left. Please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thanks a lot. Fine program. Say, Mr. Hedges, you mentioned about Campbell's Soup in Camden. Also, RCA Victor.
Yeah, they used to be there.
But more important, Walt Whitman, I know he wrote a beautiful poem about the opening of a public school. And Howard Hanson wrote a magnificent oratorio to accompany the words. And it's very stirring because you said that Camden should have the best schools. They have one of the greatest poems by one of our greatest poets, and maybe if you would get a chance, you would. Or are you familiar with it?
Not that poem. I am familiar with Whitman, and the chapter on Camden begins with a Whitman poem, and of course Joe and I visited his grave, which is in the cemetery in Camden, as well as his house.
G. Wesley, Altoona, PA. As a journalist who has devoted much of his work to the coverage and analysis of war, what do you make of Karl von Clausewitz's declaration that war is the continuation of politics? And what advice would you give to a recent college graduate, I presume it's G, interested in working in print journalism or foreign correspondence?
Well, von Clausewitz is wrong. War is not the continuation of politics by other means. War is about the destruction of all living systems, economic, political, familial, social, communal. War is something very different from politics, which is about compromise. War is about death. The essence of war is death. Von Clausewitz is wrong. In terms of a future as a print journalist, it's really tough because the monopoly that newspapers once had, connecting sellers with buyers, is gone. And that monopoly has seen newsrooms that once had hundreds of people radically diminished. Papers like the Philadelphia Inquirer that once had 700, 800 reporters and editors are now down to about 200. This is being replicated across the country. It is much more difficult for a young person who begins, as I did, as a freelance reporter, because there just aren't the outlets and the internet doesn't pay. These commercial interests don't need news organizations to connect anymore with potential consumers. And I think this means that journalists like actors, classical actors like my wife, will increasingly economically have to live on the margins. That period when you could get a job with a major metropolitan daily and earn a middle-class salary are probably over.
And from Empire of Illusion, the government, stripped of any real sovereignty, provides little more than technical expertise for elites and corporations that lack moral restraints and a concept of the common good. America has become a facade. It has become the greatest illusion in a culture of illusions. It represents a power and a democratic ethic it does not possess. It seeks to perpetuate prosperity by borrowing trillions of dollars it can never repay. The absurd folly of trying to borrow our way out of the worst economic collapse since the 30s is the cruelest of all the recent tricks played on American citizens. We continue to place our faith in a phantom economy, one characterized by fraud and lies, which sustains the wealthiest 10%. That's Chris Hedges writing in Empire of Illusion. He is the author of 9 nonfiction books, and he has been our guest for the last 3 hours here on In Depth. Very quickly, here are his books. War is a Force That Gives Us Meaning, What Every Person Should Know About War, Losing Moses on the Freeway, American Fascists, I Don't Believe in Atheists, which is now When Atheism Becomes Religion. Collateral Damage came out in 2008. Empire of Illusion, a bestseller in 2009, another bestseller. Death of the Liberal Class in 2010, and The World as It Is in 2011. Mr. Hedges, thank you for being on Book TV's In-Depth program.
Thanks for having me.
And thank you for joining us. We wish you a Happy New Year. This program will re-air tonight at midnight Eastern Time, New Year's Day, midnight, and then it will re-air again next Saturday at 9 a.m. Eastern Time. Happy New Year.